The drive up to Mirror Lake that Saturday morning felt different somehow, like the forest was holding its breath. At 29, I'd been doing nature photography professionally for about 6 years, and I'd hiked that particular trail maybe 40 times before. The parking area at the trailhead was almost empty when I arrived around 7 in the morning, just 2 other cars there, which was perfect for what I needed. I wanted to catch the early morning mist rolling off the lake surface, that golden hour light that makes everything look like a painting. My backpack was loaded with my usual gear, my Canon with 3 different lenses, the carbon fiber tripod that cost me a month's rent, protein bars, 2 water bottles, and my emergency whistle that my sister Nancy made me promise to always carry after she watched some documentary about missing hikers. The first mile of the trail was exactly how I remembered it from previous trips. Pine needles crunching under my boots, birds calling out their morning songs, that fresh mountain air filling my lungs. But around the 2nd mile marker, where the path curves near that old fallen oak tree, I noticed something strange. There were these marks on several trees, about 8 feet up from the ground, like something had been scraping the bark off in long, deliberate strips. Not random like a bear would do when marking territory, but almost methodical, forming these weird patterns that reminded me of some kind of script or symbols. The exposed wood underneath was still wet with sap, meaning whatever made these marks had done it recently, maybe within the last day or 2. I took a few shots of them, thinking it might be some interesting natural phenomenon I could research later, but when I checked the photos on my camera's LCD screen, they all came out strangely overexposed in just those specific areas where the marks were, even though my settings were perfect for the lighting conditions. About 30 minutes later, I reached the spot where the trail opens up, and you get your first view of Mirror Lake. The water was perfectly still, like glass reflecting the mountains and sky so clearly, you could barely tell where the real world ended and the reflection began. But there was no mist. In all my years photographing this lake, there had always been morning mist in weather conditions like these, with the cool night air meeting the warmer water. The absence of it felt wrong, like seeing a person without their shadow. I set up my tripod anyway near my favorite spot, this little rocky outcrop that juts out about 10 feet into the water, and started taking some long exposure shots. Through my viewfinder, I kept noticing this dark shape in the tree line on the opposite shore, maybe 300 yards away. It looked like a person standing perfectly still, but when I'd lower the camera to look with my naked eyes, I couldn't make out anything unusual in those trees. The temperature dropped suddenly while I was switching lenses. I mean, dropped hard, like going from a mild spring morning to late fall in the span of maybe 2 minutes. My breath started coming out in these thick clouds, and frost actually began forming on the metal parts of my tripod. This was mid-May in California, and the weather forecast had said it would be in the 60s all day. I pulled out my phone to check the weather app, but I had no signal, which was weird because I usually get at least 1 or 2 bars up at the lake. The screen kept flickering too, showing these strange horizontal lines like an old TV with bad reception, even though I'd just charged it fully that morning. That's when I heard it, this low humming sound coming from somewhere across the lake, not mechanical like a drone or an engine, but organic somehow, almost like throat singing but deeper, so deep I could feel it vibrating in my chest cavity. I decided to pack up and head back to the car, every instinct in my body suddenly screaming at me to leave this place. But when I tried to collapse my tripod, the legs wouldn't budge, like they'd been welded in position. The metal was so cold it actually hurt to touch, even through my gloves, and I could see my skin starting to stick to it like when you touch frozen metal in winter. I had to leave it there, just grabbed my camera and started walking quickly back toward the trail. The humming sound was getting louder, or maybe closer, and now it had this weird rhythm to it, almost like words but in no language I'd ever heard. The path I'd taken to get to the lake, the same path I'd walked dozens of times, looked completely different now. The trees seemed taller, closer together, and those strange marks I'd seen earlier were on almost every trunk now, glowing faintly with this pale blue phosphorescence that pulsed in sync with that horrible humming. Then I saw movement in my peripheral vision, something massive shifting between the trees to my left, keeping pace with me but staying just far enough back that I couldn't get a clear look at it. Every time I turned my head to look directly at it, there would be nothing there, just trees and shadows. But the second I'd look away, that movement would start again. It was like whatever this thing was knew exactly where my blind spots were and stayed perfectly within them. The trail split ahead of me at a fork I didn't remember, one path leading up toward what looked like a ridge, the other descending into a ravine filled with this thick, yellow fog that definitely hadn't been there on my way in. Neither path looked familiar, and my phone's GPS was just showing my location as a spinning circle in the middle of a blank gray screen. I could hear branches breaking behind me now, heavy footsteps that didn't match any animal gait I knew, more like something dragging itself forward in lurching, uneven movements. I chose the path toward the ridge, running now, my camera bag slamming against my hip with each step, the weight of it throwing off my balance on the uneven ground. Behind me, that dragging sound was getting faster, and the humming had changed into something else, like multiple voices all trying to speak at once, but none of them quite human. The trees on either side of the path were wrong too. Their bark had these wet, dark patches that looked like they were bleeding this thick black substance that smelled like copper and rotting vegetation. Some of the trees had grown together at the top, forming these unnatural arches over the trail that I had to duck under, and each time I passed through one, I could swear I felt something brush against the back of my neck, like fingers but too long, too cold. My lungs were burning from the thin air and the running, but I couldn't stop, especially when I realized the path behind me was changing, literally reshaping itself, the ground rippling like water and sealing over where my footprints had been just seconds before. The ridge path suddenly ended at a sheer drop I nearly ran straight off, my boots skidding on loose gravel as I windmilled my arms to keep from falling into what looked like a 100-foot vertical cliff that absolutely should not exist on this trail. There was no way around it. The trees pressed in tight on both sides, their branches interwoven like a wall, and some of them had those glowing marks now forming complete circles that hurt to look at directly. I could hear that thing getting closer, the dragging sound maybe 30 feet behind me now, and this smell hit me like ozone and spoiled meat and something chemical I couldn't identify. I turned around finally, had to see what was following me, and through my camera that I raised instinctively I saw it. The thing was impossibly tall, maybe 12 feet, but wrong in every proportion, like someone had stretched a person vertically but not horizontally, its arms hanging down past where knees should be, its head tilted at an angle that no neck should be able to support, and where its face should be was just this smooth, pale surface with one vertical slit that kept opening and closing like it was tasting the air. My finger pressed the shutter button without me even thinking about it, pure muscle memory from years of photography, and the camera flash went off even though I had it disabled. The creature recoiled from the light, making this sound like steam escaping from a broken pipe mixed with what I can only describe as backward screaming, if that makes any sense. The flash had done something to it, or maybe just surprised it, because for a few seconds it stood completely still, and in that moment I noticed other shapes moving in the trees behind it. More of these things, all different heights and proportions, but all wrong in that same fundamental way. The cliff edge was right behind me, maybe 2 feet, and I could feel loose rocks tumbling down into the darkness below. The main creature started moving again, not walking but sort of gliding forward, while its legs made walking motions that didn't match its speed, like a video where the animation is off. I kept taking pictures, the flash going off over and over, my camera making this high-pitched whining sound I'd never heard it make before, the battery indicator dropping from full to half to critical in maybe 10 seconds. Then something grabbed my ankle from below the cliff edge, not a hand, but something that wrapped around it like a rope made of ice-cold muscle, and I fell hard onto my stomach, my camera flying from my hands and landing near the edge. I could see now that the cliff wasn't empty space but filled with this writhing mass of something organic, like enormous pale worms or tentacles all twisted together, reaching up toward me. The tall creature was almost on top of me now, bending down in a way that made my eyes water, trying to process the impossible angles of its joints, reaching those two long arms toward my face. In desperation, I grabbed my camera and held down the shutter button, the flash strobing like a machine gun, and every burst of light revealed more of those things surrounding us, dozens of them, all swaying in unison to that humming sound that was so loud now it made my teeth ache. The camera grew hot in my hands, actually burning my palms, smoke starting to rise from the battery compartment. But I couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, because the light was the only thing keeping them from touching me. The camera battery exploded with a sharp crack and a burst of white sparks, the heat searing my hands so badly I screamed and threw it away from me. It landed somewhere in the darkness, still sparking and making these electric popping sounds, and without the flash, everything went dark for a moment before my eyes adjusted. But the creatures, all of them, had stopped moving completely, frozen in place like someone had hit pause on a video. The humming cut off instantly, leaving this deafening silence that was somehow worse than the noise. Even that thing wrapped around my ankle had gone rigid, still holding on but not pulling anymore. I stayed perfectly still, not even breathing, terrified that any movement would start everything up again. Then I heard it, coming from somewhere far below in the ravine, my camera's auto timer beeping, that familiar 3-beep pattern before it takes a photo. Beep, 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 flash. The light erupted from below, and in that split second of illumination, I saw all those creatures turn their heads, or what passed for heads, down toward the light source, and they moved toward it like moths to a flame. That 12-foot thing included, all of them flowing down the cliff face in that horrible, boneless way. My ankle was free suddenly, and I scrambled backward, away from the edge, my burnt hands screaming in pain as I used them to push myself up. The path behind me was clear now, completely normal looking, like none of what I'd just experienced had happened. Even those glowing marks on the trees were gone, and the temperature had returned to normal. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, following the trail that now looked exactly as it should. Familiar landmarks appearing where they should be, the fork in the path gone like it never existed. I could hear my camera still going off down in the ravine, the flash firing over and over, and each time it did, that humming would start for just a second before cutting off again. The parking lot appeared through the trees, my car sitting right where I'd left it, and I've never felt such relief as when I got inside and locked the doors. I drove out of there without looking back, my hands wrapped in torn pieces of my shirt, and I didn't stop driving until I hit the first gas station an hour away where I could call my sister and tell her I was coming home early, that I'd had an accident with my equipment and burned my hands. The burns healed after a few weeks, leaving these strange scars on my palms that look almost like those marks I saw on the trees, faint lines that form patterns I try not to think about too much. I never reported the camera or tripod as lost, just bought new ones and tried to move on with my life. But yesterday, a park ranger called me saying they'd found my equipment near Mirror Lake during a routine trail inspection. The tripod was still standing exactly where I'd left it, he said, and my camera was sitting on a rock nearby, completely intact, battery full, memory card empty except for one photo. He emailed it to me while we were on the phone, and when I opened it, my whole body went cold. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, walking away from the lake on that Saturday morning, but in the background, standing in the tree line, were dozens of those tall figures, all facing the camera, all perfectly in focus this time. The timestamp on the photo was from 3 hours after I'd made it back to my car, 3 hours after I'd already driven away. The ranger asked if I wanted to come pick up my gear, said it was in perfect condition, even had all my photos from that morning still on the memory card, everything except the ones I remembered taking of those creatures. I told him to keep it, to throw it away, to burn it if he wanted, and then I hung up and deleted his email, deleted the photo, tried to pretend I'd never seen it. The Hoh rainforest changed everything for me that October. And even now, sitting in my apartment in Seattle with every door locked, I keep checking the windows whenever I hear the slightest noise outside. I'd been working as a wilderness guide for about 4 years at that point, 31 years old, and pretty confident in my abilities to handle whatever the Pacific Northwest threw at me. The Olympic National Park was basically my second home, and I'd led dozens of groups through those ancient forests without any real incidents beyond the occasional twisted ankle or mild hypothermia case. But that particular week, I wasn't guiding anyone, just doing a routine trail assessment after the heavy rains we'd been having, making sure the paths were still safe for the upcoming tourist groups. The Park Service had asked me to check on some of the more remote camping areas, especially after a few hikers had reported feeling uneasy in certain spots, though nobody could really explain why. I remember pulling into the visitor center parking lot around dawn that Monday, the whole place shrouded in that thick coastal fog that makes everything look like a watercolor painting. My plan was simple enough: hike the 18-mile loop over 2 days, check the designated camping spots, clear any fallen trees from the trail, and document any damage from the storms. I'd done this exact route maybe 15 times before, knew every moss-covered log and every creek crossing by heart. But when I signed in at the ranger station, the volunteer there, an older guy named Harold who'd been working there forever, mentioned something that made me pause. He said they'd had 3 separate reports in the past month of hikers, hearing what sounded like multiple people talking in the deep forest, always just out of sight, always moving parallel to the trail. The weird part was that when these hikers would call out or try to approach the voices, they'd suddenly stop, like someone had hit a switch. Harold laughed it off, said it was probably just the echo effects you get in dense forest, but I noticed he wasn't quite meeting my eyes when he said it. The first few hours on the trail were exactly what you'd expect. Peaceful, almost meditative, with nothing but the sound of my boots squelching through the mud and the constant drip of water from the canopy above. The Hoh is one of the few temperate rainforests in the continental United States, and being inside it feels like walking through a living cathedral, with those massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks towering 200 feet overhead. Everything is covered in this thick green moss that muffles sound and makes the whole place feel ancient and untouched. Around mile 6, I stopped at one of the backcountry sites to check the bear boxes and make sure the creek hadn't flooded the area. That's when I found the first weird thing: a brand new camping tent, one of those expensive ultralight models, set up perfectly in the designated spot but completely abandoned. The rainfly was still taut, stakes driven in at the right angles, but when I called out and then carefully unzipped the door, there was nobody inside. Just a sleeping bag laid out neatly and a backpack propped against the tent wall. The backpack had a permit tag with the name Lena McCarthy and a date from 4 days earlier, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head, because nobody leaves their gear like that in the backcountry unless something's seriously wrong. I pulled out my radio to call it in, but all I got was static, which isn't unusual in the valleys but still made me uneasy given the circumstances. Inside the pack, everything was organized perfectly. Food sorted in stuff sacks, clothes rolled military style, first aid kit easily accessible in the top pocket. Her phone was in there too, dead battery, along with a journal where the last entry, dated 3 days ago, just said hearing them again. Closer now, maybe 20 yards parallel to my tent, at least 3 distinct voices but can't make out words, going to investigate in the morning. The handwriting got progressively shakier toward the end of the sentence, like she was writing in the dark, or maybe just scared. What really got to me though was her camping stove, still set up on a flat rock nearby with a pot of what had been instant coffee, now diluted by 3 days of rain, like she'd been in the middle of making breakfast when she just walked away. I started searching the immediate area in expanding circles, calling out Lena's name every few seconds, but the forest just swallowed my voice like it was nothing. About 15 feet from the tent, I found what made my chest tighten with genuine fear. These deep parallel grooves in the moss, maybe 3 feet apart, like something heavy had been dragged through. The moss in the Hoh grows so thick that it takes real force to tear through it like that, and these marks were deep, exposing the dark soil underneath. They led away from the campsite, heading northwest, deeper into the forest where the trail doesn't go, where the trees grow so close together that even at noon it's perpetually twilight. I followed them for maybe 20 feet before they just ended. Not gradually fading, but stopping abruptly at the base of a massive cedar tree, as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist at that spot. The ground beyond was completely undisturbed, that pristine green carpet of moss without a single footprint or broken twig. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when I heard it. Voices, multiple people talking in conversational tones coming from somewhere off to my left, but impossible to pinpoint exactly. The acoustic properties of the rainforest are strange, with all that moss absorbing and redirecting sound. But this was different from any echo or trick of the forest I'd experienced before. The voices seemed to move, sliding between the trees like smoke, sometimes sounding 50 feet away. Then suddenly much closer, maybe 10 feet, but I never saw anyone. The really unsettling part was that I could almost understand them, like when you hear people talking in the next room, and you can make out the rhythm and cadence of conversation, but not the actual words. I called out several times, identified myself as a wilderness guide, asked if anyone needed help, but the moment my voice left my mouth, the other voices stopped completely, leaving just the steady drip of water from the branches. The silence that followed was worse than the voices, that complete absence of sound that shouldn't exist in a forest full of life. And I realized I hadn't heard a single bird or squirrel since I'd found Lena's tent. I backed away slowly toward the campsite, keeping my eyes on the trees where I'd heard the voices, and that's when I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. Fresh footprints in the mud near the edge of the clearing. Lots of them, way more than could be explained by one lost hiker. They overlapped each other in chaotic patterns, some barefoot, others in what looked like boots, all different sizes, circling the campsite like whoever made them had been walking around and around the tent for hours. The prints were recent, maybe a few hours old at most based on how sharp the edges were, which meant whoever made them had been here this morning, possibly while I was hiking up the trail. But the really disturbing part was that all the prints stayed about 10 feet from the tent, never closer, like there was an invisible boundary they wouldn't cross. I got on my radio again, tried different channels, even tried my cell phone even though I knew there was no signal this deep in the park, but nothing worked. The responsible thing would have been to hike back immediately and report what I'd found, but I kept thinking about Lena, about the possibility that she might still be out there, injured or lost, needing help. Plus, it would take me at least 4 hours to get back to the ranger station, and by then it would be getting dark. I made the decision to secure her campsite, take photos of everything with my digital camera, and then do a broader search of the area before heading back. I started by walking a grid pattern through the forest, marking trees with orange surveyor's tape so I wouldn't get lost, calling out regularly, stopping every few minutes to listen. About 200 yards from the campsite, I found a cluster of fallen logs arranged in a rough circle, and in the center, scattered on the ground, were pieces of clothing, a rain jacket, hiking boots, wool socks, all women's sizes, all looking like they'd been carefully placed rather than dropped in panic. The jacket had Lena's name written on the tag in permanent marker, and the boots matched the size listed on her permit, but everything was completely clean, no mud, no moisture, like they'd been carefully washed and dried before being placed there. I photographed everything from multiple angles, my mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe she'd had some kind of breakdown, maybe there was a group of people living illegally in the park, maybe this was some kind of elaborate hoax. But none of it made sense with what I was seeing. Then I heard the voices again, much louder this time, and definitely coming from multiple directions at once, surrounding me in a rough semicircle. They were still conversational, almost casual, but there was something wrong with the rhythm, like when you slow down audio just slightly and the pitch drops, but the words stay the same. I spun around, trying to spot whoever was out there, and for just a second, I swear I saw movement between the trees, several figures walking parallel to each other, maintaining perfect spacing like they'd rehearsed it. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing. That's when I decided to get the hell out of there. Forget the search, forget protocol, just get back to civilization and let the proper authorities handle whatever this was. I started back toward Lena's campsite to grab her pack as evidence, moving fast, but trying not to run because running in the rainforest is a good way to break an ankle or worse. The voices followed me, maintaining that same conversational tone, never getting louder or quieter regardless of how fast I moved, and I could hear branches snapping somewhere behind me, steady and rhythmic like footsteps, but too synchronized, like multiple people walking in perfect unison. When I reached the campsite, I grabbed Lena's backpack, shoved her journal and phone into my own pack, and started down the trail toward the parking area. But after about 50 yards, I stopped dead because there, right in the middle of the trail where I'd walked just hours before, were more of those drag marks, fresh ones. The moss still spring back at the edges, leading off the trail in the opposite direction from where I'd found the clothes. I stood there breathing hard, trying to decide whether to follow these new marks or keep heading for safety, when I heard something that made every muscle in my body tense up. My own voice, clear as day, calling out from somewhere deeper in the forest, saying the exact words I'd used earlier when searching for Lena. Not an echo, not distorted, but perfectly clear, like a recording being played back through high-quality speakers hidden in the trees. Then another voice joined it, also mine but from a different direction, repeating my words from when I'd first found the tent, even mimicking the slight crack in my voice when I'd said her name. More voices added to the chorus, all mine, all from different moments during my search, overlapping and creating this horrible cacophony of myself talking to myself from every direction. I'm not ashamed to admit that I ran then, full sprint down that trail, branches whipping at my face, my pack bouncing painfully against my spine, those voices keeping pace with me effortlessly, now mixing in what sounded like Lena's voice too, though I'd never heard her speak, just fragments of words and phrases that might have been hers from before she disappeared. I ran for maybe 2 miles before my lungs forced me to stop, doubled over on the trail, gasping for air, and that's when I realized the voices had stopped, cut off mid-word like someone had pulled the plug on a stereo system. The normal forest sounds were back, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the wind moving through the canopy. And for a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe I was having some kind of panic attack or hallucination brought on by finding that abandoned campsite. But then I looked down at my boots and saw that they were covered in that same dark soil that had been exposed by the drag marks, even though I'd been careful to stay on the trail. I made it back to my truck just before dark, drove straight to the ranger station, and reported everything to the head ranger, who called in a full search and rescue team. They found Lena's campsite exactly as I described it, found the drag marks, even found some of the footprints, but no trace of Lena herself or the clothes I'd photographed at that circle of logs, which were somehow gone even though I had the pictures to prove they'd been there. The search went on for 2 weeks, with dogs, helicopters, even volunteer cavers checking the underground systems in the area, but Lena McCarthy was never found, and neither was any explanation for what I experienced that day. The official report lists her as missing, presumed lost in the wilderness, but I know there's more to it than that. And I think the Rangers know it too, even if they won't say it officially. I quit my job as a wilderness guide 3 weeks after the incident. Couldn't bring myself to lead people into those woods knowing what might be out there, watching, listening, copying our voices for reasons I don't want to understand. The Park Service quietly updated their protocols after that, now requiring all backcountry hikers to check in via satellite phone every 12 hours. And they've stopped issuing solo permits for that section of the trail, though they claim it's just due to increased bear activity. I still have the photos on my camera, the ones of the drag marks in Lena's clothes arranged in that circle, and sometimes I study them looking for something I missed, some clue that would make it all make sense. But the truth is, I don't think I want to know what really happened to Lena, because the only explanations that fit what I saw and heard that day are worse than not knowing at all. I've moved to Arizona now, about as far from the rainforest as I could get, and I sleep better in the desert, where you can see for miles in every direction. and voices don't hide in the trees. Oregon has always been home to me, and at 32, I'd spent most weekends exploring every trail within 100 miles of Bend. That Saturday in early September started like any other hiking day, except for the weather advisory warning about a storm system moving in from the Pacific. The forecast said it wouldn't hit until late evening, which gave me a solid 6-hour window for what should have been a 3-hour loop on the Cougar Trail. The path runs through some of the most pristine sections of the Deschutes Wilderness, winding between old-growth pines and volcanic rock formations that make you feel like you're walking through prehistoric times. I'd done this particular route maybe 15 times before, knew every switchback, every creek crossing, even had nicknames for some of the more distinctive boulders along the way. The trailhead parking area was completely empty when I pulled up around noon, which wasn't unusual for early fall when most casual hikers had already shifted to easier trails closer to town. I actually preferred it this way. Just me, my well-worn Osprey pack with the duct-taped shoulder strap, and the kind of silence you only get when you're miles from the nearest road. The air had that electric quality that comes before a big storm, making everything smell sharper, more alive. Pine resin, damp earth, that metallic tang that makes animals restless. I remember standing at the wooden trail marker, adjusting my pack straps and noticing how the birds had gone quiet. Not even the usual chatter of Steller's jays that normally followed hikers hoping for dropped trail mix. Should have paid more attention to that detail, but I was too focused on beating the weather, too confident in my ability to handle whatever the mountain might throw at me. The first mile went exactly as expected. Steady climb through Douglas firs, my breathing settling into that familiar rhythm that comes with years of conditioning. I passed the spot where lightning had split an ancient ponderosa clean in half 2 winters ago, its blackened trunk now home to woodpeckers and carpenter ants. The trail curved around a massive basalt outcropping that locals call Devil's Thumb, though it looks more like a giant fist to me. About 40 minutes in, I stopped at the creek crossing to refill my water bottle, and that's when I noticed the first weird thing. The usual muddy area where deer came down to drink was covered in fresh tracks, but they were all heading the same direction, away from the mountain, toward the lower elevations. Not just deer either. I could make out raccoon prints, what looked like coyote, even the distinctive pad marks of a black bear. All of them moving downhill, like something had spooked every animal in a 5-mile radius during the night. I actually took a photo of those tracks with my phone, thinking it would make an interesting post for my hiking group later. The image is still there in my cloud storage. Dozens of overlapping prints in the dark mud, all pointing the same direction like arrows warning me to turn around. But I kept going, telling myself it was just the approaching storm making the wildlife nervous. Another half-mile up, the trail narrowed between 2 van-sized boulders, creating this natural gateway that always made me feel like I was entering another world. Usually there were chipmunks darting across the rocks here, but today there was nothing, just the sound of wind starting to pick up in the canopy above. The temperature had dropped maybe 10 degrees since I'd started, and I pulled on my fleece jacket, the bright orange one my sister had given me specifically so hunters wouldn't mistake me for anything else. Funny how that detail would become important later, though not in the way anyone would expect. At mile marker 2, where the trail splits between the summit route and the lower loop, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There were fresh scratches on the trees, not just on one, but on maybe 7 or 8 Douglas firs in a rough circle around the trail junction. These weren't random marks. They were deliberate, deep gouges that had torn through the bark down to the white wood underneath. Each set started about 7 feet up and raked downward in parallel lines, 4 grooves at a time. The sap was still wet, beating up like blood from fresh wounds. I've seen bear markings before. They usually scratch to mark territory or just to stretch, but these were different. Too high for a black bear standing on its hind legs, and the spacing between the claw marks was wider than my outstretched hand. Mountain lions will sometimes scratch trees, but not like this, not in a pattern that seemed almost territorial. almost like a warning. The weirdest part was how fresh everything looked. The wood chips were still scattered on the ground, some still clinging to the rough bark by threads of cambium. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at those marks and trying to make sense of them. Part of my brain was already screaming at me to turn around, but the rational side kept making excuses. Maybe it was a particularly large bear. Maybe multiple animals had marked the same trees. Maybe some idiot with a cultivator tool had come through trying to make fake cougar signs for social media. You know how your mind works over time to normalize things that don't fit? That's exactly what mine was doing. I even convinced myself to keep going by reasoning that whatever had made those marks was probably long gone, had probably made them during the night when fleeing with all the other animals. The summit route would take me higher up the mountain for another 2 miles before looping back, while the lower trail would get me back to my car, faster but through denser forest. I chose to continue up, figuring the open meadows near the summit would give me better visibility. I pulled out my phone to check the time, just after 2 in the afternoon, and noticed I only had 1 bar of signal. Took another photo of the claw marks, then sent a quick text to my roommate. Weird markings on trees at Cougar Trail Junction, probably just bears being dramatic, should be back by 5. The message showed as delivered, but looking back at my phone records later, it never actually went through. The next 30 minutes were when everything started going sideways, though I didn't realize how bad things were getting until it was almost too late. The trail got steeper, winding through sections of fallen logs from a wildfire years back, and I had to focus on my footing more than usual. But even with my eyes on the ground, I couldn't ignore this growing sensation of being watched, not just observed, actively tracked. Every instinct I'd developed over years of solo hiking was firing off like alarm bells. When you spend enough time in the wilderness, you develop a 6th sense for when you're sharing space with a predator. Your body knows before your brain catches up, the way your shoulders tense, how your hearing suddenly sharpens to pick up every snapped twig, every rustle in the underbrush. I started doing these casual lookbacks, pretending to admire the view while actually scanning the trail behind me. Nothing visible, but twice I caught movement in my peripheral vision, just a flash of tawny brown that could have been anything. A deer, a dead branch swaying, my imagination running wild. The forest had gone completely silent except for my own footsteps and breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Then I heard it, a low rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like a deep purr amplified through a massive chest. The sound came from somewhere above me and to the left, maybe 30 yards into the trees. I've heard mountain lions on documentaries, even once at a wildlife sanctuary, but this was different, deeper, more resonant, almost like it was coming from something bigger than any cougar I knew existed in Oregon. My legs wanted to run, every muscle coiled and ready to sprint, but I forced myself to keep walking at the same pace. Running from a predator triggers their chase instinct. That's basic survival knowledge. Instead, I started making noise, lots of it, talking loudly to myself about absolutely nothing, commenting on the trees, the weather, rattling my water bottle against my pack. Just another hiker here. Nothing interesting, definitely not prey. That kind of desperate monologue you do when you're trying to convince yourself as much as whatever's out there. I pulled out my phone again, thinking maybe I could call for help, but the signal was completely gone. Did manage to start recording a video, holding the phone up like somehow documenting this would protect me. The footage from that attempt is shaky, mostly showing tree trunks and my orange jacket sleeve. But if you turn the volume way up, you can hear that purring sound in the background, following along as I moved up the trail. The attack happened at the switchback near the ridge, where the trail makes a sharp turn around a granite boulder the size of a small house. I came around the corner, and there it was. Not charging, not hiding, just standing in the middle of the trail about 20 feet ahead. To this day, I have trouble describing exactly what I saw because my brain kept trying to categorize it as a mountain lion, but nothing about the proportions was right. This thing was massive, probably 250 pounds of pure muscle, with shoulders that came up to my chest. Its coat was the standard tawny color, but with these strange darker markings along its spine, almost like stripes that had been smudged. But it was the eyes that made everything inside me go cold. They were reflecting the afternoon light in this unnatural green-gold color, too intelligent, too focused, like it was studying me rather than just seeing prey. We stood there staring at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then it did something I'll never forget. It smiled, or at least that's what it looked like. Its lips pulled back, showing teeth that were way too long for any cougar, and it made that purring sound again. But now I could see its throat vibrating with it. My hand was still holding my phone up, recording everything, though I wasn't conscious of it anymore. That 8-second final video everyone talks about? That was this moment, though the quality is so bad from my shaking that you can barely make out more than those glowing eyes. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second I was frozen there. The next I was crashing through the underbrush off the trail, my pack bouncing against my back, branches tearing at my jacket and face. Behind me I heard it follow, not running but moving through the forest with this horrible leisurely pace, like it knew I couldn't get away. I stumbled over a root, went down hard, and that's when I felt the first swipe across my backpack. The claws went through the fabric like paper, and I felt the straps give way. I shrugged out of it and kept running, heard it stop to investigate what I'd dropped. That probably bought me 30 seconds. My map was in that pack's side pocket, and when search and rescue found it later, it had been methodically shredded, like something with opposable thumbs had pulled it out and torn it apart piece by piece. They also found my water bottle 20 yards away, punctured by what they initially thought were knife marks until they measured the spacing. I made it another 100 yards before I realized the sounds behind me had stopped. Not gone away. Stopped, like it had just decided to let me go. I didn't stop running until I hit the lower trail, then basically fell down the last mile to the parking area. My car was still the only one in the lot when I burst out of the trees, gasping and covered in scratches from my off-trail crash. The storm was starting to roll in, dark clouds eating up the sky, and the first fat raindrops were hitting the gravel. I fumbled with my keys for what felt like forever, kept looking back at the tree line, expecting to see those green-gold eyes watching me. Nothing there, but I could feel it, still up on the mountain, still aware of exactly where I was. I drove straight to the ranger station in town. Must have looked absolutely insane walking in there, wild-eyed and bleeding, trying to explain what had happened. The ranger on duty, an older guy named Frank who'd been working the Deschutes for 20 years, took one look at me and called for backup. Not because he didn't believe me, because he did. Turns out there had been 3 other reports in the past month, all from experienced hikers, all describing the same thing. Abnormally large cougar, unusual markings, intelligent behavior that didn't match any known wildlife patterns. They'd been keeping it quiet to avoid panic, but they had a whole task force working on it. Frank showed me a cast they'd made of tracks found near another encounter. The paw print was almost 8 inches across, nearly twice the size of a normal mountain lion. They closed the cougar trail the next day, officially for storm damage assessment, but it stayed closed for 3 months. During that time, 2 wildlife biologists from Oregon State University set up trail cameras all along my route and found absolutely nothing. Whatever it was had vanished, moved on, or gotten better at avoiding detection. The theory they eventually settled on was an escaped exotic pet, maybe a cougar-leopard hybrid, that someone had been keeping illegally, though that didn't explain the size or the behavioral oddities. They never found it, and the trail reopened that winter with new warning signs about aggressive wildlife and recommendations to hike in groups of 4 or more. I went back once, about a year later, with 5 other people in broad daylight. The claw marks on those trees had been cut down, removed, but you could still see the stumps where they'd chainsawed them out. Nobody talks about it officially anymore, but if you chat with the local hikers, everyone knows someone who's seen something wrong up on that mountain. I still hike, but never alone, never that trail, and never without enough gear to make myself look as big and loud as possible. Sometimes at night when it's really quiet, I can still hear that purring sound in my memory, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next solo hiker who thinks they know these woods. November of 2018 was when everything in my life seemed to finally fall into place. I'd just landed a job as a software developer at a tech startup in Bellevue after years of grinding through contract work, and my girlfriend Jamie and I were driving back from visiting her parents in Spokane for Thanksgiving weekend. The drive through Snoqualmie Pass usually took about 4 hours, but we'd left late Sunday afternoon, hoping to avoid the worst of the holiday traffic. Jamie dozed in the passenger seat while I navigated the winding mountain roads, the sunset painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and purple. We'd been together for 3 years, and I had an engagement ring hidden in my apartment back home, planning to propose on New Year's Eve. Most of my friends from college were already married with kids by then, but Jamie and I had taken our time, made sure we were ready. Life felt perfect, predictable even, in that comfortable way where you think nothing truly bad could ever touch you. The sun had just dipped below the mountain ridges when I spotted it. This old white van, maybe from the early 90s, pulled halfway off the road and partially hidden among the Douglas firs. What caught my attention wasn't just the awkward angle it was parked at, like someone had yanked the wheel hard to the right in a panic, but the way the driver's door hung wide open, interior light casting a weak yellow glow onto the pine needles below. I'd driven this past dozens of times for work and camping trips, and you learn pretty quick that leaving your vehicle like that in November, with temperatures dropping below freezing at night, meant either someone was in serious trouble or they'd abandoned it in a real hurry. Jamie stirred when I slowed down, rubbing her eyes and asking why we were stopping. I told her someone might need help, and she immediately agreed we should check. That was Jamie, always ready to help a stranger, always seeing the good in people before considering any danger. I pulled our Subaru behind the van, leaving maybe 20 feet between us, and kept the engine running with the headlights on high beam. The van's license plate was caked with mud, but I could make out that it was from Idaho, one of those old yellow and blue ones they stopped making years ago. Jamie grabbed her phone to use as a flashlight, while I walked toward the open door, calling out, "Hello? Anyone need help?" into the growing darkness. The silence that answered back wasn't normal forest quiet. You know how the woods usually have some background noise, birds settling for the night, wind through branches, small animals rustling in the undergrowth. This was different, like the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The van's interior light illuminated worn gray seats and a dashboard covered in fast food wrappers and empty coffee cups. But what made me stop dead was the CB radio mounted above the rearview mirror, its red power light still glowing, and a voice crackling through the static every few seconds saying numbers in sequence. 47 12 91, 47 12 91. That's when Jamie grabbed my arm and pointed at the ground near the van's rear tires. There were shoes scattered in the dirt and pine needles. Little kids' shoes, maybe size 3 or 4, the kind with cartoon characters and light-up soles that flash when you walk. 5 or 6 pairs at least, some tossed carelessly, others lined up neat like someone had placed them there deliberately. One pink sneaker with unicorns on the side had fresh mud on the bottom, like whoever wore it had just been walking around. I reached out to touch the van's hood and jerked my hand back. The engine was still warm, couldn't have been off for more than 15 or 20 minutes. Jamie whispered that we should call 911 right away, but when she looked at her phone, she had no signal, which wasn't unusual for that stretch of the pass, but felt particularly unnerving given what we were seeing. The numbers on the CB radio kept repeating, and now I noticed something else. There were scratches on the inside of the van's back doors, deep gouges in the metal like someone had been trying to claw their way out. We should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in our car and drive away, but Jamie was already walking around the van with her phone's flashlight, documenting everything, saying we needed evidence for the police. She found more shoes leading into the tree line, creating this bizarre trail that disappeared into the darkness between the massive fir trunks. Some were placed in pairs, toes pointing toward the forest, Others were single shoes dropped at odd angles. The weirdest part was that they all looked relatively new. No wear on the soles, price tags still attached to some of them. Jamie bent down to examine a tiny blue sneaker when we heard it. Footsteps crunching through the undergrowth, maybe 30 yards into the forest, slow and deliberate like someone was carefully picking their way through the trees. I called out again. "Hello? Is someone there? Do you need help?" But the footsteps stopped immediately, like whoever it was had frozen in place the second they heard my voice. The CB radio suddenly squealed with feedback, making us both jump. And then a different voice came through, crystal clear this time. "They're looking at the shoes. Both of them. The woman has brown hair and a ponytail. The man is wearing a green jacket." Jamie went rigid beside me, her ponytail swaying as she spun around to stare at the radio. I was wearing my old Columbia jacket, forest green, the one Jamie always teased me about because it made me look like a park ranger. Whoever was on that radio could see us, was watching us right now from somewhere in the darkness. The voice continued, flat and emotionless like someone reading from a script. "Vehicle is a blue Subaru Outback. License plate starts with BX7. 2 subjects appear unarmed. No other vehicles visible on the road." My mouth went completely dry as I realized they were describing us, our car, giving some kind of report to someone else, and the level of detail meant they had to be close, maybe with binoculars or night vision gear. Jamie yanked my arm hard, pulling me back toward our car, and that's when I saw them. 2 figures standing perfectly still among the trees, maybe 40 feet from us. They were wearing what looked like hazmat suits, those white full-body ones you see in movies about disease outbreaks, but modified with dark patches on the knees and elbows. Their faces were covered with respirators and tinted goggles that reflected our headlights like animal eyes. One of them held what appeared to be a large butterfly net, except the netting was made of chain link, and the other had something that looked like a modified catch pole, the kind animal control uses, but with multiple loops at the end. They weren't moving toward us, just standing there, watching, their heads tilted at identical angles like they were waiting for instructions. Behind them, deeper in the forest, I could make out more white shapes moving between the trees, at least 4 or 5 others spread out in what seemed like a search pattern. Without warning, one of them raised their hand and made 3 quick gestures, pointing at us, then at the van, then drawing a circle in the air. The others immediately started moving, not toward us but fanning out to the sides, and I realized with absolute clarity that they were trying to surround us, cut off our escape route back to the car. Jamie was already running, and I sprinted after her, my boots slipping on the wet pine needles as we crashed through the 20 feet of space between us and the Subaru. I could hear them behind us now, not running but walking fast, their equipment jangling with each step, and that damn CB radio voice narrating everything. "Subjects are returning to vehicle, moving to containment position 3. Jamie dove into the passenger seat while I fumbled with the keys, my fingers suddenly clumsy and useless, and through the side mirror I saw one of them pull something from their belt that looked like a small fire extinguisher, except the nozzle was shaped wrong, more like a spray paint can with a cone attached. The engine turned over on the 3rd try and I threw it in reverse, nearly clipping the white van as I spun the wheel hard to get us back on the road. 2 of the suited figures had made it to the pavement, standing in the middle of the lane with their arms spread wide like they expected me to stop. But I swerved around them, tires screaming against the asphalt. Jamie was twisted in her seat, watching through the back window, and she gasped when one of them threw something at our car. It hit the rear windshield with a wet splat, spreading some kind of thick, clear gel that immediately started crystallizing, creating spiderweb patterns across the glass that made it impossible to see through. The speedometer hit 60 on the narrow mountain road, way too fast for those curves, but I didn't care. We needed distance between us and whatever the hell those people were doing. Jamie kept saying, "What was that? What were they doing with those kids' shoes?" Over and over, her voice getting higher with each repetition, and I didn't have answers, just this overwhelming need to get us somewhere with cell service so we could call for help. About 2 miles down the road, my phone suddenly lit up with notifications. We had signal again. Jamie immediately called 911 while I pulled into a well-lit gas station, parking right in front of the doors where the cameras could see us. The dispatcher took our report, said units were already responding to an incident at that location, which made me wonder who else had called it in. While we waited, I noticed that gel stuff on our back window was dissolving on its own, leaving no trace except a slight warping in the glass like heat damage. The police showed up 20 minutes later, 2 state troopers who looked skeptical until they saw our faces, saw how genuinely terrified we were. They said they'd found the van exactly where we described it, but it was completely empty. No shoes, no CB radio, nothing but standard vehicle registration belonging to some guy in Boise who'd reported it stolen 3 weeks ago. No signs of anyone in hazmat suits, no unusual footprints, nothing to corroborate our story except our obvious distress and that strange damage to our rear window. The trooper taking our statement, Officer Brennan, kept asking if we'd gotten any photos or videos, but Jamie's phone had somehow corrupted all the pictures she'd taken, just black squares with error messages when you tried to open them. Brennan did mention something that made my skin prickle, though. There'd been 3 other reports in the past month about unusual activity along that stretch of road, always involving abandoned vehicles and strange sightings, but never any solid evidence. He showed us a printout from another incident report where a truck driver described seeing kids' clothing arranged in patterns near mile marker 48, right where we'd stopped. But when deputies investigated, they found nothing. The other trooper pulled Brennan aside for a private conversation, and I overheard him mention something about federal jurisdiction and waiting for the liaison, which Brennan shut down quick with a look that said not in front of the civilians. They gave us their cards, took our contact information, and strongly suggested we take Interstate 90 next time instead of the pass road, especially after dark. We drove home in silence, Jamie gripping my hand tight the whole way, both of us checking the mirrors constantly. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about those children's shoes, all brand new, all sized for kids between maybe 4 and 7 years old. I did research online, spent hours going down rabbit holes about missing children in Washington and Idaho, but found nothing that matched what we'd seen. Jamie had nightmares about those figures in white suits, would wake up gasping about being chased through the forest with nets. Then, about a month later, I got a call from a blocked number, just breathing at first, then that same flat voice from the CB radio. "Stop searching. Stop talking about it. Your curiosity has been noted." They hung up before I could respond. We never drove through Snoqualmie Pass again, started taking the long way around even if it added 2 hours to our trip. Jamie and I broke up 6 months later. She couldn't handle the fear, the not knowing, the way I obsessed over finding answers. The engagement ring is still in my desk drawer, and sometimes late at night, I wonder if those kids whose shoes we found are somewhere out there, barefoot and scared, or if those shoes were all that was left of them. The not knowing is what gets you in the end. That and the certainty that somewhere out there, those people in white suits are still doing whatever it was we interrupted that night. Jason kept checking his altimeter every 10 minutes, like the numbers would somehow change if he stared at them hard enough. We were pushing through the scree field above Pumice Creek when he finally voiced what we'd both been thinking. Those clouds rolling in from the west weren't supposed to be there. The forecast had been bulletproof, 5 days of high pressure that should have given us the perfect summit window for Glacier Peak. But mountains don't care about forecasts, and by the time we reached our planned camp at 7,000 feet, the temperature had already dropped 15 degrees from what it should have been. Setting up the tent became a race against the wind that came out of nowhere, turning what should have been a 10-minute task into a wrestling match with fabric and poles. Jason actually laughed when the first gust nearly ripped the rainfly from my hands, said something about how his wife would kill him if she knew conditions were already going sideways on day 1. That night changed everything. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. Not the wind battering our tent, which had gotten strong enough to bow the poles inward with each gust. but something else underneath it. Like footsteps in the snow, except heavier, more deliberate. Jason was still out cold in his sleeping bag, snoring despite the chaos outside, so I just lay there listening, trying to convince myself it was just chunks of ice falling from the seracs above us. The sound circled our tent 3 times, always maintaining the same measured pace before stopping directly outside the vestibule. Then nothing. Just the wind screaming across the glacier and my heart hammering so hard I thought it might wake Jason up. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent to find the storm had arrived in full force. Visibility maybe 20 feet, snow coming sideways, our tracks from yesterday completely erased. We needed to descend immediately. That much was obvious. But Jason wanted to wait a few hours, see if the storm would break. He'd checked the satellite weather the night before and swore this system wasn't supposed to hit until Wednesday at the earliest. While we argued about it, brewing instant coffee in the vestibule and trying to keep the stove flame from getting blown out, I mentioned the sounds from the night before. Jason just looked at me with this expression I'd never seen on him before, kind of pale and uncertain. Turns out he'd been awake too, had heard the whole thing, but figured I was asleep and didn't want to freak me out. The way he described it made my skin prickle. He said it sounded like something was testing our tent, pressing against different sections of the fabric, looking for weak spots. We both tried to rationalize it, maybe a curious mountain goat or even a bear that hadn't gone into hibernation yet. Though we both knew bears didn't come up this high, and mountain goats didn't behave like that. The decision got made for us when the wind suddenly gusted hard enough to snap one of our tent poles with a crack like a gunshot. We were packed and moving within 15 minutes, roping up even though we could barely see each other through the whiteout. The descent should have been straightforward. We'd marked our route with wands on the way up, and Jason had GPS waypoints for every major feature. But the storm had transformed everything into an alien landscape. Snowdrifts had built up in places that were clear yesterday, and what looked like solid ground would suddenly give way to hidden crevasses filled with fresh powder. After 2 hours of fighting through conditions that kept getting worse, we realized we'd somehow gotten off route. The GPS showed us 500 feet east of where we should have been, in a section of glacier we hadn't explored on the way up. That's when Jason spotted the cave, really just a bergschrund that had opened up between the glacier and the rock face, but it offered shelter from the wind that was literally knocking us off our feet. Inside the bergschrund, the silence felt wrong after hours of wind screaming in our ears. We set up the damaged tent as best we could, using ice screws and creative rigging to compensate for the broken pole, while our headlamps threw wild shadows on the blue ice walls around us. Jason kept trying to get a signal on the satellite communicator to let someone know we were okay, but off route. The device just kept searching, unable to punch through the storm and tons of ice above us. We figured we'd wait out the worst of it, maybe 12 hours, then make another push for the descent. But while we were melting snow for water, Jason grabbed my arm and pointed his headlamp toward the back of the cave. There were tracks in the frost on the ice floor. Not our boot prints, but something else, like elongated bare feet with toes that seemed too long, heading deeper into the darkness where the bergschrund narrowed into a crack. Jason tried to joke that maybe someone else had taken shelter here earlier, but his voice cracked halfway through, and we both knew those prints looked fresh, the edges still sharp and defined. Neither of us wanted to explore deeper into that cave, but we also couldn't leave. The storm outside had turned into a full Arctic blast that would kill us in hours. We decided to take shifts staying awake, keeping watch while the other tried to sleep. During my first watch, around what must have been early evening, though it was impossible to tell in the permanent twilight of the storm, I heard it again, that same measured, heavy movement from the night before. But this time it was coming from inside the cave, from that narrow crack where the tracks led. The sound would approach, slow and deliberate, until it was maybe 30 feet away, just beyond where our headlamp beams could reach. Then it would stop for 10-15 minutes before retreating back into the darkness. Each time it came closer, lingered longer. I woke Jason after the third approach and we both sat there, ice axes in hand, staring into that black gap while our breath clouded in the freezing air. Jason whispered that we needed to move, storm or no storm. But right as he said it, something scraped against the ice right at the edge of our light. A sound like fingernails, but much larger, dragging slowly across the frozen surface. We grabbed our packs and bolted out of that cave so fast I don't even remember putting on my crampons. The storm hit us like a physical wall, visibility down to maybe 10 feet. Wind strong enough that we had to lean into it just to stay upright. Jason took the lead on the rope, using the GPS to navigate while I followed, both of us moving way too fast for conditions that bad. Every few minutes, one of us would punch through a snow bridge or lose footing on the ice, saved only by the rope between us. But we didn't slow down, couldn't slow down, because even through the howling wind we could hear something behind us. Not footsteps exactly, more like something heavy being dragged across the ice, getting closer whenever we stopped to check the GPS or catch our breath. At one point, Jason's crampon got stuck in a crack, and while he was freeing it, I turned around with my headlamp and saw a shape in the snow maybe 20 feet back. Tall, much taller than a person should be, with proportions that looked wrong, arms too long, moving in this jerky, unnatural way like it wasn't used to walking upright. The next few hours blend together in my memory like a nightmare you can't quite recall in detail. We descended blind through the whiteout, following GPS bearings that led us through terrain we didn't recognize, rappelling off ice walls we couldn't properly assess, taking risks that would have been suicidal in any other circumstance. Jason's altimeter showed we were losing elevation fast, but nothing looked familiar. The storm had erased all our wands, covered our tracks, turned the entire mountain into a maze of false leads and dead ends. Somewhere during that descent, I think around midnight based on Jason's watch, we got separated. One moment the rope was taut between us, the next it went slack. I pulled and pulled but just got more rope, until I reached the end and found it had been cut clean through. The ends frayed like something had bitten through the core. I screamed Jason's name until my throat went raw, but the wind swallowed everything. I was alone on that glacier with whatever had been following us, in a whiteout so complete I couldn't see my own feet. Training kicked in before panic could take over completely. Find shelter, stay put, wait for the storm to break. That's what every mountaineering course teaches you. I used my ice axe to probe ahead, found a wind lip in the glacier where I could dig out a small snow cave. My fingers were going numb inside my gloves as I hollowed out just enough space to squeeze inside with my pack. The satellite communicator still showed no signal. The GPS showed my elevation at around 9,000 feet, but the coordinates meant nothing without landmarks to reference. I forced myself to eat something, melt snow for water, all the mechanical survival tasks that keep you from thinking too hard about the situation. But then I heard breathing outside my snow cave, deep, rhythmic, definitely not wind. Something was circling my shelter, and occasionally I'd hear what sounded like sniffing, like a dog trying to catch a scent, except the sound was coming from at least 7 feet off the ground. I turned off my headlamp and sat in complete darkness, ice axe gripped so tight my forearms cramped, listening to that thing pace around my cave for what felt like hours. Dawn never really came. The storm just shifted from black to gray. The wind dropped from lethal to merely dangerous. When I finally worked up the courage to crawl out of my snow cave, the first thing I saw were tracks everywhere around my shelter. Hundreds of them, like whatever it was, had been agitated, pacing frantically. But these tracks were different from what we'd seen in the Bergeschrund. Some looked almost human, others were those same elongated prints, and some were just deep gouges in the snow like something had been walking on all fours. I started descending again, moving fast but careful, following what I hoped was the fall line that would eventually lead to tree line and safety. The visibility improved to maybe 50 feet, and that's when I found Jason's jacket. It was torn to pieces, hanging from an ice formation like a flag. The fabric shredded in parallel lines that looked deliberate, methodical. No blood, no body, just the jacket and his GPS unit lying in the snow still showing our plotted route. I grabbed the GPS and kept moving, trying not to think about what those claw marks in the fabric meant, trying not to notice that something was still following me, staying just outside my field of vision in the swirling snow. The tree line saved my life. After 6 more hours of desperate descending, crashing through wind-loaded slopes that could have avalanched at any moment, I finally hit the first scraggly mountain hemlocks. Whatever had been following me stopped at the trees. I could feel it watching from up on the glacier, but it wouldn't come into the forest. I didn't stop moving until I reached the trail junction at Kennedy Ridge, where I collapsed next to the wilderness permit box and finally got a signal on the satellite communicator. Search and rescue found me there 8 hours later, hypothermic and babbling about Jason still being up on the mountain. They launched a massive search that went on for 5 days once the storm cleared. They found our shredded tent right where I said it would be, found the Bergeschrund with those strange tracks already half filled with new snow, found scraps of Jason's clothing scattered across a 1/4 mile of glacier. But they never found Jason. The official report blamed the separation on whiteout conditions and suggested he fell into a crevasse, his body likely buried under tons of avalanche debris. They didn't mention the tracks in their report, said the photos I'd taken were too blurry to make out anything definitive, just wind patterns in the snow. I went back to Kennedy Ridge 2 months later, on a clear day in early autumn when you could see Glacier Peak perfectly against the blue sky. Brought binoculars and spent hours scanning the glacier where everything happened. And I saw it, just once, for maybe 10 seconds before it disappeared behind a serac. That same tall, wrong-shaped figure moving across the ice in broad daylight with those jerky, unnatural movements. But here's what really haunts me. It was wearing Jason's red summit jacket, the one he always wore for photographs at the top. The thing wearing his jacket stopped and turned toward me, like it knew I was watching from 5 miles away. Then it raised one of those 2 long arms in what looked like a wave before disappearing into the ice. I haven't been back to the mountains since. I tell people it's because I lost my climbing partner, which is true enough. But the real reason is that sometimes, on cold nights when the wind picks up, I can still hear those careful, measured footsteps circling my house, and I know that one day, when the conditions are just right, it's going to come looking for the one that got away. "26 years old, and 6 months into my job with the Forest Service, the solitude of the wilderness had become exactly what I needed after my divorce. It was early June when they handed me the assignment to inspect the trail system near Ape Canyon, on the northeast side of Mount St. Helens. The area had been closed since winter due to some severe storm damage, and with hiking season ramping up, they needed someone to assess whether the trails were safe for public use again. My supervisor, a weathered guy named Bill who'd been with the service for 3 decades, pulled me aside before I left and told me the locals had been calling in complaints about strange noises coming from that area. Probably just elk or maybe some loose rocks from the spring thaw, he said, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine when he said it. The drive up took about 3 hours from the ranger station, winding through increasingly narrow roads until I reached the trailhead parking area, completely empty except for my government-issued pickup truck. The morning started normally enough, I remember, because I made a point to log everything in my field notebook. Standard procedure for solo inspections. Started hiking at 7:30 sharp, temperature around 55 degrees, light cloud cover moving in from the west. The first 2 miles of trail were in decent shape. Just some typical erosion and a few downed branches I could clear myself. But as I got deeper into the canyon, following the path that runs parallel to Muddy River, things started to feel different in a way I still struggle to describe. The forest there is old growth, massive Douglas firs and hemlocks that block out most of the sunlight even on clear days. But that morning it felt especially dark, like the trees were crowding in closer than they should. About 3 miles in, I found the first real damage. A section of trail completely obliterated by what looked like a landslide, except the debris pattern made no sense. Rocks and logs scattered uphill from the trail, which goes against basic physics unless something threw them there. I radioed back to base around 9:15 to report the trail damage, and that's when I heard them for the first time. Voices, distant but unmistakably human, calling out from somewhere deeper in the canyon. They weren't hikers. The area had been closed for months and I'd seen the locked gate myself at the access road. The voices seemed to bounce off the canyon walls in this weird way that made it impossible to pinpoint their direction. But what really got to me was that they were calling my name. Not hello or help or any of the things you'd expect from someone lost or in trouble, but Caleb specifically, drawn out and repeated like they were trying to get my attention. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, radio in hand, trying to make sense of it while Bill's voice crackled through asking if I needed backup. Told him I was investigating possible unauthorized hikers and would check back in 30 minutes. Standard protocol for unexpected contact in restricted areas. The voices grew clearer as I pushed through a section of Devil's Club and salmonberry bushes that had overgrown the trail since winter. They weren't exactly louder, but more distinct, like whoever was calling had figured out the perfect frequency to cut through the forest noise. My name echoed maybe every 30 seconds, always from a different direction, sometimes sounding like it came from the canopy above, other times seeming to rise up from the ravine below, where muddy river churned over volcanic rocks. I kept my radio on channel 3, the emergency frequency, and marked my GPS coordinates every 100 yards or so. Training kicked in even though my mind was racing through rational explanations. Maybe it was some locals playing a prank, knowing the Forest Service would send someone up here eventually. Or possibly an acoustic phenomenon caused by the canyon's unique shape combined with the river noise. But none of that explained how they knew my name, since my assignment had been decided just yesterday afternoon in a closed meeting. Around 9:45, I reached a section where the trees opened up into a small clearing, maybe 60 feet across, and that's where I saw the markings. Every single tree surrounding the clearing, and I counted 23 of them, had these deep gouges in the bark, starting about 8 feet up and extending to nearly 15 feet off the ground. The marks were fresh, sap still oozing and sticky, forming these thick amber ribbons down the trunks. They weren't random either. 4 parallel lines, each about 2 inches apart, repeated over and over like something had systematically worked its way around the perimeter. I pulled out my field camera to document them, and through the viewfinder I noticed something else. Strips of fabric caught on the higher branches, tan and olive green like Forest Service uniforms, but weathered in a way that suggested they'd been there for weeks, not months. The voices had stopped the moment I entered the clearing, replaced by this oppressive silence where even the birds had gone quiet, just the distant sound of the river far below. I need to be clear about what happened next because I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head trying to make sense of it. While photographing the marked trees, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, not an animal or person, but the trees themselves seeming to sway despite there being no wind. The motion started on the north side of the clearing and rippled clockwise, each tree bending slightly toward the center where I stood, their tops dipping maybe 10 or 15 degrees before straightening again. The whole sequence took maybe 20 seconds, and as the last tree on the eastern edge completed its bow, the voices returned. Except this time they weren't just calling my name. They were having a conversation, multiple distinct voices speaking in overlapping fragments that included my name, my employee ID number, details about my divorce that I'd never told anyone at work, and strangest of all, they were describing what I was wearing but getting it wrong. Describing a red jacket instead of my green one, boots I'd thrown away months ago, mentioning a wedding ring I no longer wore. The radio crackled to life with Bill's voice asking for my status update. It had been 28 minutes since my last check-in. When I pressed the talk button to respond, my own voice came through the speaker before I could say anything, except it was me from that morning, repeating the exact words I'd said to Bill when I'd first arrived at the trailhead. The transmission played for maybe 10 seconds, then cut to static, and when I tried again, pressing different combinations of buttons, switching channels, even removing and reinserting the battery, the same recording would play. The voices in the trees grew louder during each transmission, not in volume but in number, like more people were joining the conversation, and they started describing things that hadn't happened yet. Me falling on wet rocks, me finding something metal half buried in the trail, me running through underbrush with torn clothes. I decided to head back immediately, Forget the rest of the trail inspection. Just get to my truck and drive straight to the ranger station. The path back should have been straightforward. I'd been marking waypoints on my GPS the entire time, leaving small orange flags at trail junctions, following standard wilderness protocol. But when I turned around, the clearing had changed. Not dramatically, not impossibly, just wrong in subtle ways that made my chest tight with panic. The marked trees were there, but the gouges were older looking, filled with dried pitch and starting to heal over, months of growth sealing the wounds. The fabric strips in the branches were gone, and in their place hung something else. Survey ribbons, the bright pink ones we used for marking hazard areas, except these had dates written on them in black marker, all from different years going back to 1987, all with the same message. Caleb Meyer, found location. My GPS showed my exact position hadn't changed, still in the same coordinates I'd logged minutes ago. But the device's date display was cycling randomly through different years, the numbers blurring too fast to read. I ran. Not jogged, not walked quickly, but full-on sprinted through the undergrowth, crashing through salmonberry bushes and sliding on the damp earth, following what I thought was the trail back. The forest seemed to resist my movement. Branches that should have snapped bounced back with unusual force. Roots appeared where my feet were about to land, and the grade of the slope kept shifting like the mountain itself was breathing. Behind me, or maybe ahead or from both sides simultaneously, I could hear footsteps matching my pace perfectly, except they were slightly off rhythm, like an echo that arrives too early. The voices had changed too, no longer calling my name but having full conversations about me in the third person, discussing my personnel file, my work performance, my psychological evaluation from the hiring process, reading aloud notes that sounded exactly like Bill's writing style, but describing incidents I knew had never happened. Me getting lost for 3 days, me filing reports about temporal inconsistencies, me requesting transfers to different forests every few months. After what felt like an hour but my watch showed as only 12 minutes, I burst out onto a section of maintained trail, one with fresh gravel and new drainage channels, clearly recent work. The problem was, this trail shouldn't exist. I knew every inch of the Ape Canyon trail system from studying maps for weeks before this assignment, and this wide, professionally graded path simply wasn't on any of them. But it led downhill, toward where my truck should be, so I followed it, trying to ignore how the trail markers showed distances that made no sense, claiming I was simultaneously 2 miles and 7 miles from the trailhead. The wooden signs at intersections were all perfectly new but dated from 1980, each one listing trail conditions and warnings about recurring acoustic anomalies and temporal displacement zones, terms I'd never seen in any Forest Service documentation. My radio had gone completely dead, not even static, and when I checked my phone, which I'd kept off to preserve battery, it showed 17 missed calls from Bill, all somehow from tomorrow's date. The final stretch to the parking area was the worst part. I could see my truck through the trees exactly where I'd left it, but the forest between me and it kept stretching, adding trees that weren't there before, inserting gullies and creek beds that I had to navigate around. Other vehicles appeared and disappeared in the parking area, Forest Service trucks from different decades, personal cars I didn't recognize, once even a horse-drawn wagon that flickered in and out like a bad signal. The voices had become a roar, hundreds of them now, all discussing different versions of Caleb Meyer, Forest Ranger, some saying I'd died in 1987, others claiming I'd never been born, a few insisting I was still married, still in college, still in high school, had retired last year, was scheduled to start work next month. When I finally reached the parking area, stumbling out of the tree line covered in scratches and mud, my truck was there, but it was wrong. Same model, same color, but the license plate had digits that hurt to look at directly, like they were cycling through every possible combination simultaneously. I got in, started the engine, which sounded both perfectly normal and completely alien, and drove. The access road was the same and different. Familiar curves in unfamiliar sequences, landmarks I recognized in the wrong order or at impossible distances. The radio turned itself on, scanning through stations that were broadcasting news from various years. weather reports for dates that had passed or hadn't arrived yet, and occasionally recordings of my own voice giving trail reports I'd never made. Took either 3 hours or 30 minutes to reach the ranger station. My dashboard clock never settled on a single time. When I pulled into the parking lot, Bill was waiting outside, but when he saw me, his face went pale and he immediately called for backup on his radio, saying they'd found me, that I was back, even though from my perspective, I'd only been gone since morning. Turns out I'd been missing for 3 days. My truck found abandoned at the trailhead with all my equipment scattered around it, covered in what they described as volcanic ash from an eruption that hadn't happened. My radio broadcasting my voice on repeat saying I could hear someone calling my name from the trees. The first time I came across that cabin was during a long day of fieldwork in the forest. I had been assigned to map out remnants of old timber roots for a conservation study, something that usually meant long hours of hiking and collecting data. It was early autumn and the air had that sharp, resinous smell of wet pine. I remember feeling a strange calm walking that deep into the forest. No cell service, no hum of traffic, only the constant chatter of birds and the crunch of moss under my boots. My partner, Drew, had gone back to the trailhead after our GPS malfunctioned, leaving me to finish one last section before dusk. That was when I noticed what looked like the edge of a roof behind a cluster of old cedar trees. The path to it was barely visible, more like a memory of a trail than something people still used. Branches hung low and wet, brushing my jacket as I pushed through. The structure appeared suddenly, half hidden under layers of moss and ivy, but still sturdy. It was a small logging cabin, maybe 12 by 16 feet, built from thick, darkened logs. What caught my eye was how clean it seemed beneath all that decay, like time had bent around it. The padlock on the door had rusted, but the hinges looked strangely new. I remember wiping the grime off the small window and feeling my heartbeat pick up when I saw what was inside. There was a lantern hanging from a beam, a steel thermos on the table, and a folded jacket draped over a chair. Everything coated in a fine layer of dust, yet untouched by animals or weather. It felt like whoever lived there had stepped out only yesterday. The air inside was thick with the smell of old tobacco and engine oil. I flipped through a stack of papers on the table and realized they were handwritten shift logs from the early 80s. The names, the notes about tree lines and equipment, all perfectly legible. I took a few photos for the report, mostly to prove it was real, because by then I already had this creeping thought that no one would believe me. I radioed Drew, but the line crackled with static. He had probably reached the truck by then, too far for the signal. I decided to mark the coordinates manually before heading back. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of something odd on the wall, a fresh set of boot prints near the door, the kind you make when stepping through damp ground. They were sharper than they should have been in a place untouched for decades. For a moment, I told myself maybe they were mine, though the spacing looked too wide, too deliberate. I left the cabin feeling both curious and uneasy, as if I had interrupted something I was not meant to see. That night, back at the motel, I uploaded the photos and typed a quick summary for our supervisor. The images looked sharper on screen than they had in person. The texture of the wood grain, the dust caught mid-air in the camera flash, even a faint reflection in the window that I could not explain. It looked almost like a face, though distorted by glare. I tried not to dwell on it. Drew read through the notes and laughed, saying maybe I had stumbled on a hermit's hideout. But the site had been decommissioned 40 years ago. No one was supposed to live anywhere near there anymore. The next morning, we drove back with 2 park officers and a local historian who had worked on forest preservation records. I led them straight to the coordinates I had marked, certain we would find the cabin exactly where it stood the day before. The trail looked the same at first, the same twisted roots and patches of fern, but the clearing where the cabin had been was empty. No walls, no logs, not even splintered wood, just churned soil and a rectangle of darker earth, like the ground still remembered where it had been. One of the officers thought it might have been dismantled long ago, but that made no sense. It had been there less than 24 hours earlier. They searched for signs of dragging or tool marks, but there were none. It looked as if the structure had simply sunk or dissolved. The historian walked the perimeter quietly before saying something that made my stomach tighten. He claimed there had been stories from old loggers about a phantom shack deep in those woods, a place where workers once stayed after an accident shut down the line in the early 80s. He said they never found the last crew who logged that section, only their tools and a half-written ledger. I could tell the officers dismissed it as folklore, but I could not shake the feeling that I had stood inside that missing camp. We stayed out there for hours, circling the clearing, hoping to find even a nail or hinge. At one point, Drew found a small patch of ash beneath the soil, faintly gray and cold to the touch, as if something had burned there long ago. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, like the air itself was heavier. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, only the faint whisper of wind moving through trees. When we finally decided to leave, I turned one last time to look at the clearing. For a second, I could swear I saw the outline of the cabin shimmer between the trunks, there and not there, before vanishing like mist. I did not tell anyone. Back at the ranger station, I showed the photos again, insisting that someone had to explain how an entire building could vanish overnight. One of the officers suggested I might have mistaken another site for the one we saw that morning, but the GPS coordinates matched perfectly. Drew backed me up. He had seen the cabin himself from a distance the day before. The historian asked to keep a copy of the shift logs, but when I went through my folder, they were gone. Every single photo still showed the cabin, but the papers I had collected had simply disappeared. My bag was zipped the entire time. That night, sleep did not come easily. I kept replaying the moment I stepped inside that cabin. The faint echo of dripping water, the smell of rust and wood smoke, the way the light from my headlamp had bent across the walls. Around 2 a.m, a knock came at my motel door. Not loud, just 2 slow taps like someone waiting. When I opened it, the hallway was empty, but on the floor lay a small folded piece of paper. Inside, in smudged pencil, was a single line: "You should not have taken anything." I drove back home the next morning without saying a word to Drew. Over the next week, strange things kept happening. My GPS would show coordinates deep in that same forest every time I turned it on, no matter where I was. A faint smell of oil and pine clung to my jacket even after washing it. One night I woke to find dirt on my bedroom floor, shaped like boot prints leading from the door to the corner of the room. I kept telling myself it was just stress, that maybe I had mixed up the photos, imagined the note, anything that made logical sense. But the dread stayed. It was like the forest had followed me home. I filed a final report and asked to be reassigned to a different region. The supervisor agreed without much questioning, maybe sensing I was done. Months later, out of curiosity, I checked the satellite imagery for those same coordinates. The clearing looked empty, except for a faint rectangular shadow that did not belong to the surrounding trees. Every time I zoomed in, the image flickered, like it was resisting focus. I have not gone back since. Sometimes, though, when I pass a stretch of pine on the highway, I catch that same smell: wet moss, tobacco, and something burning, and I wonder if the cabin is still out there, waiting for another visitor to find it. My name is Tessa Vaughn, and that day belonged to the kind of trip that resets your head after too many months of fluorescent lights and reheated dinners. The plan was a simple loop through hardwood forest in the Upper Peninsula, a modest challenge with a few unmarked spurs for people who like to wander. No guide, no group, just a pack, a paper map with coffee stains, and the promise of a quiet creek for lunch. Life felt crammed with small obligations back then. Answering emails from a borrowed couch, babysitting a neighbor's terrier, saving up for new boots and never buying them. The trailhead sat beside a shuttered bait shop with a hand-painted muskie on wood, its eye flaked to raw pine. A white sedan with a dented door was the only other car, windows cracked, stale mint gum wrappers on the dash. The air smelled like wet leaves and rust, like a barn after rain. Steps sank into moss and every stride hummed with that first silence you get when your phone finally gives up the last bar. 2 hours in, a weathered post appeared where the map showed nothing, just a splintered plank with the word cedar burned into it, and an arrow slanted wrong. Curiosity tugged harder than caution ever does when the sun sits high and your legs feel steady. The spur was narrow, hemmed by ferns and young poplar, and the ground underfoot changed from spongy to the rasp of old cinders. Blue bottle caps and a green plastic comb lay half buried in duff, too recent to belong to the era of logging, too forgotten to be anyone's picnic. Birdsong thinned out, wind went quiet, the slope dipped, and my boots knocked against squared stones peeking through roots like teeth. A dark rectangle revealed itself between alders, a low structure where a building should not be, boards grayed to the color of smoke. The creek bed beside it had collapsed into a shallow scar, dry as a knuckle. The mill looked wrong in a way that does not rely on superstition. Roof ribs showed through where tin had peeled back, and a half circle of bolts ran along one wall, the arc where a saw once swung. Pine pitch still bled in glassy beads from a beam near the entrance, as if time had stopped mid-drip. A metal sign lay face down in leaves. Flipping it with my boot revealed the words Cedar Hollow Lumber in faded red, and beneath it, a smaller line that someone had scratched out with a blade. The doorway yawned wide, framed by 2 posts scarred waist-high like belts had rubbed there for years. Inside, dust hung in the light like fine flour, and a swallow burst from the rafters and vanished through a gap with a sound like a card flicking spokes. Every step answered with a dry whisper, nails talking to old wood. Polaroids covered the far wall, 100 small windows pinned with finishing nails, edges curled from damp. Some were sun-bleached to the color of milk. Others still held their blues and greens, faces caught mid-laugh, mid-squint, mid-sweat at a trail junction. People posed with backpacks, with dogs, with walking sticks whittled from saplings. The captions were written in different hands but always in the same place, a stripe of Sharpie across the bottom border. First names, a trail nickname, sometimes a distance or a weather note. A few showed pairs, a few showed trios. Several showed a lone person, centered as if someone else had taken the shot and then stepped back into the trees without a word. One detail snagged me harder than the rest. Every photograph wore a small notch near the top edge, as if trimmed with the same dull blade, the same length lost every time. The pattern felt deliberate, like a habit learned and never questioned. I stood there longer than I meant to, tracing faces with my eyes, half expecting one of them to blink. A gust came through a split in the siding and turned a few Polaroids sideways, making them sway like cards on a string. That sound, the faint ticking of plastic against the wall, echoed louder than it should have. My flashlight beam caught a corner where newer nails glinted silver against old wood. The photos there were crisp, colors still sharp, no sun fade at all. One showed a woman in a red jacket at a trail sign that looked familiar. It took a few seconds to realize I had passed that very sign earlier that day. The angle, the moss on the post, even the broken branch leaning behind it. It was identical. The next photo over showed a car parked by the bait shop. The same dent on the door, the same sun visor half down. My pulse thudded inside my ears, a sound so heavy it filled the space. I stepped back, trying to make sense of it, and my boot knocked something metallic. A Polaroid camera, the kind with a yellow stripe, sat on its side near a pile of splintered lumber. It had a fresh pack inside. The little counter window read 3. I lifted it out of reflex, then set it down just as quickly. Something about touching it felt wrong, like interrupting a process that was still happening. Dust motes spiraled in the light, and the faint click of the camera's shutter arm shifted on its own when the wind changed. My fingers itched to check the film, but I walked to the doorway instead, needing distance from those faces. Outside, the air felt heavier, the light dimmer, though clouds hadn't moved. A strange hush covered the forest, the kind that makes you notice your own breathing. The sedan was gone when I reached the top of the hill. The trail seemed longer on the way back. My map felt useless. Landmarks that had been obvious before, downed birch, broken post, a hollow stump, were either missing or doubled. It was like walking inside a loop that had forgotten where it began. I must have taken a wrong turn because the creek appeared again, dry and familiar, and there the mill stood exactly as before. This time, smoke trickled faintly from one of the roof gaps, thin and gray, dissolving before reaching the trees. A sound came with it, slow tapping, like nails being set, deliberate and patient. I shouted, partly to prove I was still the only living thing out there. No answer came. The tapping stopped. Then something slid down the wall inside. A shuffle of paper, a soft thump. I could not leave it alone. The doorway framed the same beam of light as before, but now only one Polaroid hung on the far wall. Just one. It glowed faintly in the dust. I stepped closer, heart punching a steady rhythm, not sure whether I wanted to see it or not. The picture was still drying. You could smell the chemical tang. It showed the doorway of the mill, empty except for a blurred figure at the edge of the frame, standing just outside the light, half turned as though walking away. The figure's backpack matched mine. My throat went dry. I remember backing out slowly, not running because running might make whatever was happening real. When I turned for the main trail again, the sound of the creek returned, steady and cold, though the bed had been dry before. By the time I reached the bait shop clearing, daylight had thinned into that gray edge where everything looks both near and far. The lot was empty. Tire tracks vanished in shallow puddles that reflected the warped Muskie sign. My car door was locked, same as before, but the back seat smelled faintly of smoke, and something white stuck to the inside of the window. Another Polaroid, taped with yellowing adhesive. It showed the mill from a distance taken through trees as if from the trail itself. The same beam of light spilled through its doorway, but now a figure stood inside, holding a camera pointed toward the trees. I drove without checking the mirror, hands gripping the wheel until the highway swallowed the forest. That night in the motel, sleep would not come. The heater rattled and coughed, and I kept checking the chair where my backpack sat, half expecting to hear the click of a shutter. The Polaroid lay on the table under a cup of coffee I did not drink. I called the local ranger office the next morning. A man answered with the kind of patience used for tourists who think they have seen ghosts. He asked for the name of the trail, then went quiet for a long stretch before telling me the mill at Cedar Hollow had been demolished more than 20 years ago after a fire. No structure standing there now, he said flatly, as if rehearsed. I thanked him, hung up and packed fast. The air outside smelled like rain again, but no clouds lingered above the trees. A few weeks later, an officer contacted me after I sent them the Polaroid. They confirmed it matched the spot where several hikers had disappeared over the last 2 decades. Every one of their cases had been filed after the mill's documented demolition. The photographs they recovered from the scene, those not ruined by moisture, showed the same pattern I had seen. The notched edges, the names, the faces half smiling into the woods. None of the missing people were ever found. The camera, they said, contained undeveloped film, but every frame came out blank, pure white. The officer's tone held a pause before ending the call, as though something still bothered him that he could not put into words. Sometimes I wake up certain I can still smell the chemical sting of fresh Polaroid film, that sharp sweetness that dries at the back of your throat. I deleted the digital copies of the pictures months ago, but one file keeps reappearing in my cloud storage, always with the same name, Cedar Hollow Joe 01. When I open it, the image loads grain by grain until it settles into view. The doorway of the mill again, faint smoke rising, and a single figure standing inside. The outline never matches my posture, but the backpack is still mine. I have changed every password I own, but it keeps coming back like the forest is not finished with me yet. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Every year, my friends drag me to some New Year's Eve event, and every year I swear it will be the last time. But 2023 felt different. I had just gone through a rough breakup, spent most of December alone in my apartment, and Megan practically showed up at my door to physically pull me out of my isolation. Our little group of 4 had been inseparable since college. Me, Megan, her boyfriend Troy, and my coworker Dennis, who joined our circle after we started working together at a marketing firm downtown. We had all graduated back in 2015, which meant we were hitting that strange phase where half our friends were having babies, and the other half still could not commit to a city. That night, we took a rideshare to the waterfront to watch the fireworks, grabbed some tacos from a food truck, and planned to catch another ride home before surge pricing made the trip cost more than our entire evening out. Everything went smoothly until around 2:30 in the morning, when we were already on our way back. The ride home was through Uber Share, one of those shared ride apps where you split the fare with strangers heading in the same direction. Our driver was a quiet guy named Oscar, who had a small Colombian flag hanging from his rearview mirror, and played soft reggaeton at a volume that felt respectful for the late hour. There were 2 other passengers already in the minivan when we climbed in, a young couple who looked like they had partied way harder than us, the girl already half asleep against the window with glitter smeared across her cheek. The route took us through the northern suburbs, and by the time we hit the residential streets past Oakwood Heights, everything was dead silent. Most people were either still celebrating downtown or passed out at home. The houses looked eerie in the darkness, deflated inflatable snowmen lying flat on frozen lawns, string lights blinking on timers with nobody awake to notice them. Oscar was taking a shortcut through a neighborhood I did not recognize when we stopped at a red light at a 4-way intersection, and that is when everything changed. A dark blue sedan was stopped in the lane next to us, slightly ahead so we could see directly into the driver's side window. At first, I thought the 2 people inside were just having an argument, the kind of loud, messy fight that couples have after drinking too much on a holiday. But then the driver's arm came up, and I saw his fist connect with the woman's face. Not a slap, not a shove, a full closed fist punch that snapped her head against the passenger window. Megan gasped beside me, and Troy leaned forward between the front seats to get a better look. The driver hit her again, this time grabbing a fistful of her hair and slamming her head against the dashboard. The woman was not fighting back. She was not even trying to protect herself. Her arms hung limp at her sides like she had already given up, like this was not the first time. I could see blood on her face now, dark and shiny under the streetlight, smearing across the window where her cheek pressed against the glass. Oscar muttered something in Spanish and looked at us through the rearview mirror, his eyes wide with the same disbelief we all felt. Troy did not hesitate. He reached over and slammed his palm against the horn, holding it down for a solid 5 seconds. The sound cut through the silent neighborhood like a scream, and the man in the sedan stopped mid-swing. His head turned slowly toward our minivan, and I got my first clear look at his face. He was maybe in his 40s, with a thick neck and a shaved head that gleamed under the amber streetlight. His eyes were not wild or crazy like I expected. They were cold, calculated, like he was sizing us up and deciding what to do about the interruption. The light turned green, but nobody moved. For a long, horrible moment, we just stared at each other through the glass. Then his lips curled into something that was not quite a smile, and he raised one finger, pointing directly at our windshield, directly at us, before slowly pulling his car forward and turning right. Dennis already had his phone out, dialing 911 before the sedan even completed the turn. Oscar hit the gas the moment the other car was out of sight, and I felt the minivan lurch forward as we sped through the intersection going straight, putting as much distance as possible between us and whatever we had just witnessed. The young couple in the back row had woken up now, the girl asking in a confused, slurred voice what was happening. Nobody answered her. I was twisted around in my seat, watching the road behind us through the rear window. my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. For about 30 seconds I thought we were clear. The street behind us stayed empty, just dark asphalt and parked cars and the occasional porch light. Then a pair of headlights swung around the corner. Fast, way too fast. And I knew immediately it was him. He had circled the block. He had come back for us. Dennis was still on hold with 911, the automated message repeating something about high call volume due to the holiday, and I wanted to scream at the recording that someone was about to die tonight if they did not pick up. Oscar was driving faster now, weaving through the residential streets with a focus that told me this was not his first time in a bad situation. The sedan stayed about 50 feet behind us, matching our speed exactly, never falling back and never getting closer. It was like he wanted us to know he was there, wanted us to feel him right on our tail. Troy was trying to get a photo of the license plate through the back window, but between the darkness and the motion, everything came out blurred. Megan had her arm around me, squeezing tight, and I realized I was shaking, not from cold, but from pure adrenaline flooding every part of my body. The streets were completely empty, every house dark, everyone asleep, or passed out from celebrating. We passed a stop sign without even slowing down, and the sedan did the same. Then another. Oscar made a sharp left turn without signaling, tires squealing against the pavement, and for a moment I thought we had lost him. But when I looked back, those headlights were already rounding the corner behind us, steady and patient, like a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to go. The sedan surged forward without warning, closing the gap between us in seconds. I heard Megan scream as the headlights flooded our back window, so bright I had to shield my eyes. He was right on our bumper now, close enough that I could make out his silhouette through the glare. That thick neck, that bald head, one hand on the wheel and the other doing something I could not see. Oscar swerved hard to the right, and the sedan clipped our back corner with a crunch of metal that sent us fishtailing across the empty street. The young couple in the back was fully awake now, the guy yelling questions that nobody had time to answer. I grabbed the headrest in front of me and held on as Oscar regained control, my teeth rattling from the impact. The sedan had fallen back a few car lengths, but I could see a fresh dent in his front bumper gleaming under a streetlight. And I could see him laughing. Actually laughing, his mouth wide open, shoulders shaking with amusement like this was the most fun he had experienced in years. That image burned itself into my memory. A man who beats women in his car, who chases strangers through empty streets at 3 a.m, laughing like he was watching a comedy show. Finally, a voice came through Dennis's phone. A real human voice, tired and stressed but real. He started talking fast, giving our location as best he could, describing the sedan, the assault we witnessed, the chase that was now entering its 5th minute. The dispatcher told us to stay on the line, to keep moving, that units were being sent, but response times were delayed because of the holiday. Delayed. That word hit me like a punch to the chest. We were being hunted through a sleeping neighborhood, and help was delayed. Oscar shouted that he was heading toward the main road, hoping there would be more traffic, more witnesses, maybe even a police car doing a routine patrol. But the residential street seemed endless. Block after block of identical houses with their porch lights off and their curtains drawn. The sedan rammed us again, harder this time, and I heard something crack underneath the minivan, a sound that made Oscar curse loudly in Spanish. Troy was trying to calm everyone down, telling us we just needed to make it to Bleecker Avenue, where there would be gas stations and a 24-hour diner, but his voice was trembling so badly that the words came out in pieces. We almost made it. I could see the glow of commercial lights ahead, the familiar red and yellow of a gas station sign rising above the rooftops like a beacon. Oscar pushed the minivan as hard as it would go, the engine whining in protest, and for a few beautiful seconds the sedan fell behind. But then came a sound that made my stomach turn, a rhythmic thumping from somewhere beneath us, getting louder with each rotation of the wheels. The first impact had done more damage than we realized. Oscar was losing control, the steering pulling hard to the left no matter how much he fought it. We limped through one more intersection before he had no choice but to pull over, the minivan shuddering to a stop against the curb in front of a dark house with a for sale sign in the yard. The gas station was maybe 3 blocks away. It might as well have been 3 miles. The sedan rolled up behind us and stopped, its headlights illuminating the interior of our vehicle like a stage. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We sat there in that harsh white light, waiting to see what he would do next. The driver's door of the sedan swung open, and he stepped out onto the street. He was bigger than I expected. Not just the thick neck I had noticed before, but broad shoulders and arms that strained against a dark jacket. He walked toward us slowly, deliberately, his boots making a sound against the asphalt that seemed impossibly loud in the silent neighborhood. Dennis was still on the phone with 911, whispering our new location, begging them to hurry. Oscar reached under his seat and pulled out a tire iron, his jaw set tight, and Troy grabbed the back of his seat like he was ready to jump out and help if it came to that. The man stopped about 10 feet from our rear bumper and just stood there, staring at us through the back window. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and I felt every muscle in my body tense so hard that my vision started to blur at the edges. But he did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a cigarette and a lighter, lit it casually, and took a long drag while watching us like we were animals in a cage. He wanted us to know that he was in control, that he could take his time, that nobody was coming to save us. The standoff lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like an hour. He finished his cigarette slowly, flicking the butt onto the pavement and grinding it under his boot. Then he started walking toward us again, and this time Oscar threw open his door and stepped out, the tire iron gripped tight in his right hand. I wanted to scream at him to get back inside, but my voice was stuck somewhere deep in my chest. The two men faced each other across the empty street, and I could see the calculation happening behind the aggressor's eyes, weighing whether this was worth it, measuring Oscar up, deciding if he could take him. That is when we heard it. Sirens. Faint at first, but getting louder, coming from somewhere to the east. The man heard them too, and something shifted in his posture. He took one step back, then another. His eyes swept across our minivan one final time, locking onto each of us through the windows like he was memorizing our faces. Then he pointed at us again, that same slow, deliberate gesture from the intersection, and walked back to his sedan. He got in, reversed smoothly, and disappeared down a side street just as the first red and blue lights appeared in the distance. By the time the patrol car reached us, he was gone. The cops took our statements for almost an hour, parked there on that dark residential street while the sky slowly turned gray with the first hint of dawn. They found the woman from the sedan at a hospital emergency room about 40 minutes later. She had walked in alone, bleeding from a gash above her eyebrow, and refused to say who hurt her. She would not press charges, would not even confirm that she knew the man we described. The police told us this happens more often than people think, that victims protect their abusers for reasons that are complicated and heartbreaking, and that without her cooperation, there was not much they could do. They never caught him. I spent weeks checking news sites, waiting for a story about a bald man with a thick neck arrested for assault or worse, but it never came. Sometimes I still think about that woman, wonder if she got away from him eventually, or if she is still trapped in that car, flinching every time his hand moves. And I think about the way he looked at us through that back window, smoking his cigarette, so patient and calm. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he would get away with it. The thing that haunts me most is not the chase or the fear. It is the fact that somewhere out there, he is still driving those same streets, and the next person who honks at a red light might not have sirens coming to save them. My buddy Nathan texted me on December 28th, asking if the crew was still doing downtown Portland for New Year's Eve. We had kept this tradition alive since graduating together in 2015, and no matter how crazy life got, that one night stayed sacred. So on December 31st of 2024, 6 of us headed to Pioneer Courthouse Square for the big countdown. Nathan brought his girlfriend, Brooke. Our friend Theo came with his brother Julian, and I invited Priscilla from my office, who had just moved to Oregon and never experienced the madness of a proper downtown celebration. The energy was electric from the moment we stepped off the MAX train around 10. Thousands of people packed into the square, breath visible in the cold air, everyone buzzing with that particular excitement that only exists in the final hours of a dying year. We found a decent spot near one of the food vendors, close enough to see the stage where a local band was playing covers of classic rock songs that got swallowed by crowd noise. By 11:30, the crowd had tripled. What started as a comfortable gathering transformed into a crushing mass of bodies pressed together so tight, I could feel strangers breathing against my neck. People kept pushing forward toward the stage, and our little group got separated despite our best efforts to hold on to each other. I lost sight of Nathan first, then Theo and Julian vanished somewhere to my left when a wave of people surged past. Priscilla grabbed my arm and shouted something I could not hear over the noise, but within seconds she got pulled away too, her hand slipping from mine like water through fingers. My phone had died an hour earlier because I forgot to charge it before leaving home, which meant I had no way to text anyone or check our meeting spot. The air grew thick and warm despite the freezing December temperature, a strange mix of body heat and alcohol breath and perfume that made my head swim. I needed to get out just for a minute, just enough space to breathe and think and figure out where everyone went. I pushed sideways through the crowd, using my shoulders to carve a path toward the edge of the square. It took almost 10 minutes to move 50 feet, squeezing between couples holding champagne bottles and groups of college kids wearing glittery hats and blowing noisemakers directly into my ears. When I finally broke free from the densest part of the gathering, I found myself near the corner of Southwest Yam Hill and 6th Avenue, where the crowd thinned enough that I could actually extend my arms without touching another person. A small side alley opened up between two older brick buildings, one of them a closed antique shop with iron bars over the windows. I stepped into the mouth of that alley just to catch my breath, leaning against the cold brick wall and letting the winter air fill my lungs. The noise from the square still thundered behind me, but here it felt muffled, distant, like listening to a concert from outside the venue. I checked my watch and saw 11:47 glowing in the dim light. 13 minutes until midnight, and I had no idea where my friends were. That was when the first firework exploded overhead. Someone had jumped the gun on the countdown, sending a burst of red and gold across the sky that lit up the alley in flickering colors. In that brief flash of light, I saw them. About 40 feet deeper into the alley, two men in dark jackets were dragging a woman toward a service door at the back of one of the buildings. She was struggling, her legs kicking against the pavement, one of her heels scraping the concrete as they pulled her. I saw her mouth open wide, saw her body twist and fight, but the boom of the fireworks swallowed whatever sound she made. For a second, I just stood there, my brain trying to process what my eyes were showing me. Another firework went up, this one green and white, and in its glow I saw her face clearly. Young, maybe mid-20s, mascara streaking down her cheeks, pure terror in her eyes. One of the men had his hand clamped over her mouth while the other gripped her arm so hard I could see the fabric of her silver dress bunching under his fingers. I did not think. I just moved. My feet carried me deeper into the alley before my brain could calculate the danger, and I heard myself yelling something like, "Hey, stop," or "Let her go." I cannot remember the exact words because my heart was pounding so loud it drowned out my own voice. The two men stopped and turned toward me. The fireworks kept exploding above us, painting their faces in bursts of color that made them look almost unreal. The one holding her mouth was shorter, stocky, with a shaved head and a neck thick as a tree trunk. The other was taller and leaner, wearing a black beanie pulled low over his forehead. They did not look panicked or surprised. They looked annoyed, like I was a fly buzzing around their dinner. The tall one said something to his partner in a language I did not recognize, then let go of the woman's arm and started walking toward me. His steps were slow and deliberate, almost casual, and that calmness scared me more than if he had charged. He stopped about 6 feet away from me and tilted his head to one side like he was studying an insect. He spoke in accented English, his voice low enough that I had to strain to hear it over the distant roar of the crowd and the ongoing firework bursts. "Wrong place, friend. Turn around. Go back to your party." His hand moved to his jacket pocket, and he pulled the zipper down just enough to show me what was inside. The blade caught a flash of blue light from a firework overhead. A folding knife, already open, the edge gleaming. He did not pull it out or wave it around. He just let me see it, let me understand what would happen if I stayed. Behind him, the stocky one still had the woman pinned, his hand tight over her face, and I could see her eyes fixed on me, wide and desperate, begging me not to leave. My mind raced through options like a slot machine spinning too fast to read. I could run back to the square, try to find a cop, but the police barricades had been set up around the main stage area, and I had seen officers redirecting people away from the side streets to manage the crowd flow. By the time I found someone and explained what was happening and led them back here, these men would be gone. The woman would be gone. The tall man took another step toward me, close enough now that I could smell cigarette smoke on his jacket. "Last chance," he said, and something in his tone told me he meant it. Behind us, the crowd in the square started the countdown. 10, 9, 8, their voices rising in unison like a distant wave. I looked past him at the woman, at the tears streaming down her face, at her fingers clawing uselessly at the stocky man's arm. 7, 6, 5. I thought about my dad, who passed away when I was 19, and how he always said that a man is defined by what he does when no one is watching. 4, 3, 2. The tall man smirked and started to turn back toward his partner, assuming I had made my choice. 1. The sky erupted in a symphony of explosions, a cascade of color and thunder that shook the windows of the buildings around us. And in that moment, while the tall man's attention flickered upward for just a fraction of a second, I grabbed a metal trash can lid leaning against the wall and swung it at his head with everything I had. The lid connected with the side of his skull with a sound I will never forget. A hollow, wet thunk that vibrated up through my arms and into my shoulders. He stumbled sideways, crashing into a stack of wooden pallets, and the knife clattered out of his hand onto the pavement. I did not stop to see if he was getting up. I ran past him toward the stocky one, who had released the woman's mouth to reach for something in his own pocket. She screamed then, a raw and broken sound that cut through even the roar of the fireworks, and threw her elbow backward into his ribs. He grunted and loosened his grip just enough for her to twist free. She fell to her knees on the concrete, scrambling toward me on all fours, her silver dress torn at the hem and her hair wild around her face. I grabbed her arm and pulled her up, already turning back toward the mouth of the alley. But the tall man was on his feet again, blood running down the side of his face, and he had retrieved his knife. He stood between us and the way out, his expression no longer annoyed but something much worse. Focused, predatory, like a hunter who had just decided his prey was worth the effort. The woman clutched my arm so hard her nails dug through my jacket sleeve. "There's another way," she gasped, her voice hoarse from screaming. "I saw it when they brought me in. A gate at the back leads to the next street." I did not have time to question her. The stocky man had recovered from the elbow to his ribs and was moving toward us now, flanking his partner, trapping us in a pincer. I turned and ran deeper into the alley, pulling the woman with me, our footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The fireworks were still going, burst after burst, lighting up the narrow passage in strobing flashes of red and gold and green. We passed dumpsters overflowing with cardboard boxes, a rusted bicycle chained to a pipe, puddles of something dark I did not want to identify. The alley twisted left, then right, opening into a small courtyard surrounded by the back entrances of closed businesses. A chain-link gate stood at the far end, maybe 7 feet tall, topped with barbed wire that glinted in the intermittent light. The woman pointed at it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "There, we can climb it." I heard footsteps behind us getting closer, and the sound of the tall man cursing in that language I could not place. I reached the gate first and grabbed the chain link with both hands, testing its strength. It rattled, but held firm. I turned to the woman and cupped my hands together, creating a step for her foot. "Go, I'll boost you over." She hesitated for just a second, looking at me with an expression I could not read. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief that a stranger would do this for her. Then she put her foot in my hands, and I lifted her up, my arms screaming from the effort as she grabbed the top of the fence and hauled herself over. She cleared the barbed wire somehow, leaving a strip of silver fabric caught on one of the points, and dropped down to the other side with a grunt of pain. I started climbing after her, my fingers hooking through the diamond-shaped gaps in the chain link, my shoes slipping on the metal. I was halfway up when a hand grabbed my ankle and yanked me backward. I lost my grip and fell, landing hard on my back in the courtyard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The tall man stood over me, knife in hand, blood still dripping from his temple where I had hit him. His partner was right behind him, blocking any chance of escape back the way we came. The tall man crouched down beside me, pressing the flat of the blade against my cheek. I could feel how cold it was, how sharp the edge, and I thought about how strange it was that this might be the last thing I ever felt. "You should have walked away," he said, almost sadly, like he regretted what he was about to do. The fireworks had slowed down now, the grand finale fading into scattered pops and crackles, and I could hear the distant cheering of the crowd celebrating the new year. I was going to die in this dirty courtyard while thousands of people toasted champagne less than 2 blocks away. The stocky man said something to his partner, gesturing impatiently toward the gate where the woman had escaped. They were arguing, I realized. The stocky one wanted to go after her, finish what they started. The tall one seemed more interested in punishing me for interfering. Their disagreement bought me a few seconds, and I used them to scan the ground around me for anything I could use. My hand found a chunk of broken concrete near the base of the wall, about the size of a baseball, with jagged edges that bit into my palm. I did not have a plan. I just knew I was not going to lie there and let them decide my fate. I swung the concrete chunk upward with everything I had left, catching the tall man in the jaw. I heard teeth crack, heard him howl in pain, and then I was on my feet and running. Not toward the gate, but back into the maze of alleys, hoping to lose them in the darkness. My lungs burned and my back throbbed where I had fallen, but I kept moving, turning corners at random, knocking over trash cans behind me to slow them down. I burst out of an alley onto Southwest Stark Street and nearly collided with a group of drunk partygoers stumbling toward their ride. "Call 911, I shouted at them, not stopping to explain, and then I saw something beautiful. 2 police officers on bicycles, stationed at the corner to manage pedestrian overflow from the main event. I ran toward them, waving my arms, screaming about the woman and the men and the knife. They must have thought I was crazy at first, some drunk guy having a breakdown, but something in my face convinced them to take me seriously. One of them radioed for backup while the other followed me back toward the courtyard, and by the time we got there, the 2 men were gone, vanished into the night like they had never existed at all. The police found the woman 2 blocks away, sitting on the curb outside a late-night diner, shaking and crying but alive. Her name was Valerie, and she told the officers that the men had grabbed her outside a bar on Southwest Alder Street while she was waiting for her Uber. She had been at a party with co-workers, stepped out alone to get her ride, and within seconds they had her. She did not know them, had never seen them before, had no idea why they targeted her. The detective who took my statement said it was likely a random abduction, possibly connected to a trafficking operation they had been investigating for months. They never caught the 2 men. The security cameras in that part of downtown were either broken or pointed in the wrong direction, and the descriptions I gave, stocky bald guy, tall guy with a beanie, matched about 1,000 people in Portland that night. Valerie reached out to me through the detective a few weeks later, wanting to thank me in person. We met at a coffee shop in the Pearl District, and she brought me a gift card and a handwritten note that I still keep in my desk drawer. She told me she had nightmares every night, that she could not walk down the street alone anymore, that she had moved back in with her parents in Beaverton because she could not stand being in her apartment by herself. I did not know what to say. I just told her I was glad she was okay, and I meant it. Nathan and the others had spent 3 hours looking for me that night before I finally tracked them down at the police station where I was giving my statement. Priscilla cried when she saw me. Julian kept saying "dude" over and over like his brain had short-circuited. Brooke made me promise to never do anything that stupid again, and I lied and said I would not. The truth is, I do not know what I would do if I saw something like that again. I hope I would be brave. I hope I would act. But I also know now what it feels like to have a knife pressed against your face, to feel completely certain that you are about to die, and that knowledge changes you in ways you cannot explain. It has been almost a year now. I still go downtown sometimes, still walk past that alley on Southwest Yamhill. The antique shop is a smoothie place now. The courtyard got cleaned up and turned into a small parking lot. There is no sign that anything ever happened there. No memorial, no marker. Just concrete and brick and the ordinary flow of people going about their lives. But every time I pass it, I think about Valerie. I think about those two men, still out there somewhere. And I think about what my dad said, that a man is defined by what he does when no one is watching. On New Year's Eve of 2024, in a dark alley while the whole city looked up at the sky, I found out what kind of man I am. I just wish the answer did not still keep me awake at night. Kayla had been begging me to come to her neighborhood party for weeks. My younger sister moved to a cul-de-sac in suburban Phoenix right after her wedding in 2022, and this was her first time hosting anything bigger than a dinner. New Year's Eve seemed like the perfect occasion, she kept saying, and her neighbor Vic had promised to handle the fireworks. I remember rolling my eyes when she mentioned that part during our phone call. Fireworks in a residential area always made me nervous, but she assured me Vic knew what he was doing. He had connections, she said, worked for some company that did pyrotechnics for events. At 34, I should have trusted my gut more than my little sister's enthusiasm. But she sounded so excited, and I had spent the last 3 New Year's celebrations alone in my apartment with cheap champagne and whatever was streaming. So I drove the 2 hours from Tucson, arriving just as the sun was setting behind the stucco houses and dyeing the whole street this gorgeous shade of burnt orange. The backyard was smaller than I expected, maybe 40 feet deep before it hit a wooden fence that separated my sister's property from the house behind her. Vic had set up his equipment near that fence, which struck me as odd even before I understood what I was looking at. There were these metal racks, almost like ladder frames holding thick cardboard tubes pointed at the sky. A folding table next to them was covered with boxes I could not read from across the yard. Around 30 people milled around on the patchy grass, holding plastic cups and paper plates loaded with appetizers. Tiki torches lined the perimeter, their flames dancing in the slight breeze. My sister ran over the moment she spotted me, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like her vanilla perfume, and the sangria she was clearly already enjoying. She introduced me to a blur of faces I immediately forgot. Neighbors and co-workers and friends of friends, everyone in that buzzing pre-midnight mood where strangers become temporary best friends. I grabbed a drink and tried to relax, but my eyes kept drifting back to those tubes near the fence, counting them. There had to be at least 20. Around 11, Vic started gathering everyone closer to watch him prep the show. He was a stocky guy in his 50s with a gray goatee and a baseball cap that said something about veteran pyrotechnicians. His hands moved with confidence as he checked connections and adjusted angles, and I noticed he was wearing thick leather gloves. That detail should have reassured me, but it did the opposite. If he needed protection, what about the rest of us standing 15 feet away with nothing but flip cups in our hands? I mentioned this to a woman next to me, a redhead named Donna, who lived 3 houses down. She laughed and said Vic did this every year, that he was a total pro. Her 8-year-old son was sitting cross-legged on the grass near the front of the crowd, his face lit up with anticipation. I wanted to suggest she pull him back a bit, but I did not want to be that person, the paranoid guest ruining everyone's fun. So I stayed quiet, sipping my drink, watching Vic move between the racks like a surgeon preparing his instruments. The countdown started at 5 minutes to midnight. Someone had connected a phone to a portable speaker, and we could hear the broadcast from Times Square mixing with the neighborhood noise, other parties on adjacent streets, distant pops and crackles from early fireworks, dogs barking in protest. Kayla found me in the crowd and grabbed my arm, her eyes glassy from the sangria, but her smile so genuine it made me feel guilty for being anxious. She said this was going to be amazing, that Vic had spent over $2,000 on this display. I remember thinking that was insane, that amount of money on something that would last maybe 10 minutes. But then everyone started counting down from 30, and I got swept up in it despite myself. The voices around me grew louder. 20, 15, 10. Vic stood by his setup with a long lighter in his hand, waiting. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The cheering erupted, people hugged and kissed, and Vic touched the flame to the first fuse. The first few shots were beautiful. I will give him that. Golden bursts that spread across the sky like dandelion seeds caught in a wind, followed by crackling red ones that sounded like 1,000 tiny whips snapping at once. Everyone tilted their heads back, mouths open, the colors reflecting in their eyes. I felt myself relaxing a little, thinking maybe I had been ridiculous to worry. Vic moved along the rack with practiced ease, lighting fuses in sequence, stepping back to admire his work before moving to the next. The show was synchronized in a way that felt almost musical, the explosions building on each other in rhythm. I pulled out my phone to record a clip for my social media, something I rarely did, but the display was genuinely impressive. Then came a deeper boom, one of those big mortars that shake your chest from the inside. A purple flower bloomed overhead, and everyone gasped and applauded. Vic raised his fist in triumph. That was when I noticed the rack on the far left had started to tilt. It happened so fast that my brain almost refused to process it. The metal frame leaned maybe 5 degrees, then 10, and before anyone could react, one of the tubes fired. Not up, but sideways, almost parallel to the ground. The mortar shot across the yard like a flaming comet, trailing sparks and smoke, and slammed into the wooden fence about 3 feet to my right. The explosion was nothing like the ones in the sky. This was concentrated, violent, a punch of light and heat that sprayed splinters in every direction. Someone screamed, a sound that cut through the ringing in my ears. I stumbled backward and collided with a man I did not know, both of us nearly falling onto a knocked-over lawn chair. When I looked up, the rack had tilted further, and I could see the next tube in line, its fuse already burning down. It was pointing directly at the crowd. I do not remember making the decision to scream. The sound just ripped out of me, raw and primal. A single word repeated over and over. Move, move, move. People were already stumbling in different directions, but most of them had no idea what was happening. The sky was still exploding with color from the other racks that had not fallen, and the noise was so overwhelming that my warning barely carried. I grabbed the arm of the person closest to me, an older man with a white beard who looked completely disoriented, and yanked him toward the sliding glass door that led into the house. The second mortar fired just as we moved. I heard it more than saw it, a whooshing hiss followed by an impact somewhere behind us. Glass shattered, one of the tiki torches maybe, or a window. The old man tripped on a cooler and went down hard, pulling me with him. My knees hit the concrete patio, and the pain was sharp and immediate. But I forced him up because I could hear another fuse crackling in that terrible countdown rhythm. The backyard had descended into absolute chaos. Folding chairs were everywhere, knocked over by people trying to flee in every direction at once. I saw Donna sprinting toward the side gate with her son in her arms, his face buried against her shoulder. Someone was crying, a high-pitched keening sound that mixed with the ongoing explosions overhead. Vic was shouting something I could not understand, waving his arms near the fallen rack like he could somehow will it back into position. Another mortar launched from the tilted frame, and this one went low and fast, skipping off the grass before detonating against the back wall of the house. Stucco crumbled and rained down in chunks. A window on the second floor shattered outward, spraying glass onto the crowd below. I felt something sting my forearm and looked down to see blood, a thin line where a shard had sliced through my skin. The pain was distant, unreal. All I could think about was finding Kayla. I spotted her near the back door, crouched behind an overturned patio table with 2 other women. Her eyes found mine across the yard, And even in the strobing light of the fireworks still launching from the upright racks, I could see how terrified she was. Her mouth was forming my name, but no sound reached me through the cacophony. I started moving toward her, staying low, weaving between abandoned chairs and spilled drinks. The grass was slick with something, beer maybe, or the sangria from a shattered pitcher. My foot caught on a power cord and I nearly went down again, catching myself on the edge of a plastic table at the last second. Another mortar fired from the fallen rack, and I watched it arc sideways into the neighbor's yard. The explosion lit up the fence line, and I heard a woman over there start screaming in Spanish. The whole neighborhood was awake now, porch lights flicking on up and down the street, but nobody could help us. The remaining tubes were still loaded, still connected to whatever chain of fuses Vic had rigged, and they were going to keep firing until every last one was spent. I reached Kayla and pulled her into a crouch beside me, both of us pressed against the side of the house where a small overhang offered some protection. Her whole body was trembling, and when she grabbed my hand, her fingers were ice cold despite the warm Arizona night. She kept saying she was sorry over and over, like this was somehow her fault for inviting me. I told her to stop, that we needed to focus, that we needed to get inside the house. The sliding glass door was maybe 15 feet away, but crossing that open space felt like crossing a minefield. I counted the tubes I could still see on the fallen rack. 4, maybe 5. It was hard to tell in the chaos. Each one was a bomb waiting to go off in a random direction. Vic had finally backed away from the equipment, his face pale and slack, all that earlier confidence completely gone. He was just standing there, frozen, while people ran past him toward any exit they could find. I wanted to scream at him, to ask him what kind of professional let something like this happen, but there was no time. The next fuse was already sparking. I grabbed Kayla by the wrist and we ran. Not toward the sliding door anymore. There were too many people crowding that entrance, pushing and shoving in blind panic. Instead, I pulled her along the side of the house, toward the narrow gate that led to the front yard. The space between the house and the fence was barely wide enough for us to move single file, and I could feel the heat from the explosions radiating off the stucco wall beside me. Another mortar fired behind us and the sound was deafening. A crack followed by a roar that seemed to vibrate through my entire skeleton. Something whizzed past overhead, trailing orange sparks. We burst through the gate and stumbled onto the front lawn just as the last few tubes emptied themselves into the night. From this angle, I could see the damage clearly. The scorched fence, the blackened patch of grass, the smoke pouring from a hole in the side of the house where one of the mortars had punched through. Fire was licking at the edges of that hole, small but growing. Someone was already on the phone with 911. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. The aftermath felt like waking up from a nightmare only to find out everything was real. Paramedics treated 7 people for burns, cuts, and smoke inhalation. Donna's son had a piece of wood embedded in his calf that required surgery. He still walks with a slight limp today. The old man I had dragged to safety suffered a mild heart attack from the stress and spent 3 days in the hospital. Vic faced criminal charges for reckless endangerment and operating unlicensed fireworks in a residential area. Turned out his connections were just a guy he knew who smuggled professional-grade mortars from Mexico, and he had no real training at all. Kayla's house needed over $40,000 in repairs. She sold it 6 months later and moved to a different state. Said she could not stand being in that backyard anymore. I still have a faint scar on my forearm where the glass sliced me, a thin white line that catches the light when I move a certain way. Every New Year's Eve since then, I stay inside with all the curtains drawn. When midnight comes and the fireworks start outside, I put on noise-canceling headphones and turn the television up as loud as it will go. Some sounds you just never want to hear again. January 1st, 2024, started with my pager going off at 6 in the morning. Volunteer firefighting in rural Hendricks County, Indiana had been part of my life for about 3 years at that point, long enough to have seen my share of car wrecks, kitchen fires, and the occasional barn collapse. My wife Shelley groaned next to me in bed, still half asleep from the New Year's Eve party we had hosted the night before. I kissed her forehead, threw on my gear, and drove my pickup through the frozen darkness toward State Road 39. The dispatcher said it was a single-vehicle accident. SUV versus a drainage ditch. Possible entrapment. Standard stuff for icy roads and hungover drivers who thought they could make it home after celebrating too hard. Having just turned 34 the previous month, I figured I had seen enough of these calls to know exactly what to expect. I remember thinking I would be back in time for breakfast with the kids. When I arrived at the scene, the sun was just starting to bleed pink and orange across the flat Indiana farmland. The SUV, a dark green Ford Explorer, maybe 2018 model, had gone off the road and flipped into the frozen ditch at an ugly angle. Chief Randy Bowman was already there with his truck, along with 2 other volunteers, Cliff Sanger and a newer guy named Pete, who had joined us maybe 6 months prior. The driver was out of the vehicle, sitting on the frozen ground about 15 feet away from the wreck, and I could see blood running down the side of his face even from a distance. He was a white male, maybe mid-40s, wearing a heavy coat and jeans, and he was rocking back and forth slowly like a man in shock. I grabbed my medical bag and started walking toward him, but something about the way Chief Bowman was standing near the SUV made me pause. He had this look on his face, not panic, but something close to confusion mixed with concern, and he waved me over before I could reach the injured driver. "Garrett, come take a look at this," Randy said in a low voice as I approached. He was shining his flashlight into the back of the overturned Explorer, illuminating the cargo area through the shattered rear window. The vehicle was resting on its roof, so everything inside had collapsed downward in a mess of broken glass, loose items, and what looked like camping gear. But there was something else in there too. Something large, wrapped in a blue tarp and secured with bungee cords. The shape was unmistakable even before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. It was roughly 6 feet long, narrower at one end than the other, and the tarp had partially come loose during the crash, revealing what looked like a bare human foot sticking out from beneath the plastic. Pale, waxy, with toenails that had been painted a dark shade of red. I took a step back without meaning to, my boots crunching against the frozen gravel. Randy grabbed my arm and pulled me aside, away from the vehicle, his breath coming out in thick white clouds. "I already called dispatch," he whispered. "Sheriff's on the way, but that's going to be at least 30 minutes, maybe more with these roads." I looked back at the driver, who was still sitting on the ground in that slow rocking motion, blood dripping from a gash somewhere above his hairline. Pete had approached him now and was trying to get him to respond to questions, but the man seemed completely unaware of his surroundings. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing in particular, and his lips were moving slightly like he was talking to himself. Cliff jogged over to where Randy and I were standing, his face flushed from the cold. "What's the situation with the vehicle? We need to check for other passengers or—" Randy cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. "Nobody touches that SUV until the sheriff gets here. We got a situation." He didn't elaborate, but something in his tone made Cliff go quiet immediately. The 4 of us stood there in the growing morning light, the frozen cornfields stretching out in every direction, and I became acutely aware of how isolated we were. The nearest farmhouse was probably half a mile away, and there wasn't another vehicle in sight on the long, straight ribbon of State Road 39. Just us, the overturned Explorer, the bleeding man, and whatever was wrapped in that blue tarp. I told Randy I should at least try to treat the driver's head wound before he bled out or went into shock, and he agreed with a reluctant nod. As a volunteer firefighter with EMT basic certification, stabilizing injured people was part of the job, even when those people might be involved in something criminal. I grabbed my kit and walked over to where Pete was crouching beside the man, trying unsuccessfully to get him to make eye contact. Up close, I could see the driver more clearly now. He was probably 45 or 50, with a thick build and rough hands that suggested manual labor, construction maybe, or farm work. His face was weathered and lined, his hair cut short and streaked with gray, and there was a small scar running through his left eyebrow that looked old, maybe decades old. The gash on his head was about 2 inches long, bleeding steadily but not catastrophically, located just above his right temple. I introduced myself, told him I was there to help, and asked if he could tell me his name. He didn't respond. His lips kept moving in that silent mutter, and when I leaned closer to try to hear what he was saying, I caught fragments of words that didn't quite connect, something about not supposed to be here, and she made me promise. I cleaned the wound as best I could and applied a pressure bandage while Pete held a flashlight steady. The man didn't flinch, didn't react at all to my touch, which was concerning on its own. Head injuries can do strange things to people, and I had seen accident victims act completely detached from reality before, their brains struggling to process trauma. But there was something different about this guy, something in the way he held his body, rigid, almost defensive, like he was bracing for an attack that hadn't come yet. When I finished with the bandage, I tried again. "Sir, can you tell me what happened? Were you driving alone?" For the first time, his eyes focused, locking onto my face with an intensity that made me want to lean back. His pupils were uneven, which suggested a concussion, but there was awareness behind them now. Real, frightened awareness. "You can't look in there," he said, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Please, you have to understand. You can't look in there." I kept my voice calm, professional, the way we were trained. "Sir, we've already seen what's in the vehicle. The sheriff is on his way. Right now, I need to make sure you're okay." His face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he was going to cry. Instead, he grabbed my wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong and pulled me closer, his breath sour and metallic from the blood he had swallowed. "She was already dead," he whispered. "I swear to God she was already dead when I found her." I pulled my wrist free and stood up, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Randy had walked over during the exchange and heard the last part, his expression hardening into something unreadable. "Found her where?" he asked, his voice flat and controlled. The driver looked up at him, then back at me, then at Pete like he was calculating something in his damaged head. For a long moment, I thought he was going to shut down again, retreat back into that vacant stare. But instead he started talking, slowly at first, then faster, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He said his name was Vernon Hatch, that he lived about 40 miles north in a town called Frankfurt, that he worked as a groundskeeper at a private cemetery outside of Lafayette. He said he had been driving home from a New Year's Eve gathering at his brother's house when he saw the body on the side of the road, just lying there in the frozen grass near a bridge overpass. A woman, young, maybe late 20s, wearing nothing but a thin dress despite the freezing temperature. He said he stopped to check on her and realized immediately that she was dead. No pulse, no breath, her skin already cold and stiff. He panicked. He didn't know why, couldn't explain it even to himself, but something in his brain told him that if he called the police, they would blame him. So he wrapped her in a tarp he had in his truck, loaded her into the back of his SUV, and started driving with no clear destination in mind. That was when he hit the ice patch and lost control. None of us said anything for a long moment after he finished. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the frozen landscape, and I could hear the distant sound of a truck engine somewhere down the road. Vernon Hatch sat there on the frozen ground, his bandaged head drooping, his hands trembling in his lap. His story was insane, the kind of thing that sounded like a lie specifically because no rational person would ever do what he claimed to have done. But there was something in his voice, in the way his eyes kept darting toward the overturned Explorer, that made me wonder. I had dealt with liars before, people who caused accidents and tried to blame road conditions or other drivers or mechanical failures. They usually had a smoothness to them, a practiced quality to their excuses. Vernon didn't have that. He sounded like a man who had made a catastrophic decision in a moment of panic and was only now realizing the full weight of what he had done. Randy crouched down in front of him, his knees popping in the cold air. "You're telling me you found a dead woman on the side of the road, and instead of calling 911, you decided to put her in your vehicle and drive away?" Vernon nodded miserably. "I know how it sounds, I know, but I'm telling you the truth. I didn't hurt her. I didn't even know her. She was just lying there and I didn't know what to do. The sound of the approaching engine grew louder, and I turned to see a Hendricks County Sheriff's cruiser coming down State Road 39, its lights flashing but no siren. Behind it, maybe a quarter-mile back, I could see what looked like an ambulance. Relief washed through me. This was no longer our problem to figure out. Whatever Vernon Hatch had done or hadn't done, it was about to become a matter for people with badges and investigative authority. Deputy Connie Russo stepped out of the cruiser, a tall woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and a face that looked like it had seen every kind of human ugliness over a long career. She took in the scene with quick, practiced eyes. The overturned SUV, the injured man on the ground, the four of us standing around in our firefighter gear looking like we had just witnessed something we couldn't quite process. Randy walked over to meet her, and I watched them have a brief, intense conversation, their breath fogging in the cold air. Deputy Russo's expression didn't change, but I saw her hand move to rest on her holster as she glanced toward Vernon. She said something into her radio, then walked over to where he was sitting and crouched down in front of him, her posture calm but alert. I couldn't hear what she said to him, but I saw Vernon start talking again, his hands gesturing weakly as he repeated his story. The paramedics arrived and started working on Vernon while Deputy Russo walked over to the SUV with Randy and shined her flashlight into the cargo area. I stayed back with Pete and Cliff, the three of us watching in silence as she examined the blue tarp and its contents. After a few minutes, she stood up and made another radio call, her voice too low for me to hear the words, but her tone unmistakably serious. More units were coming. I could tell that much from the way she kept looking down the road, waiting. Pete lit a cigarette with shaking hands and offered me one, but I shook my head. "You think he's telling the truth?" he asked quietly. "About finding her like that?" I didn't have an answer. The whole situation felt surreal, like something from a crime documentary rather than a Tuesday morning in rural Indiana. I kept thinking about that foot sticking out from under the tarp, the dark red nail polish, the waxy pallor of the skin. Somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, maybe somebody's mother. Whoever she was, she had been alive not too long ago. And now she was a body in the back of a wrecked SUV, and the only person who might know what happened to her was a man who claimed he had just been trying to do the right thing in the worst possible way. Over the next hour, the scene transformed into something out of a procedural drama. 2 more sheriff's vehicles arrived, followed by a state police cruiser and a white van from the county coroner's office. Yellow crime scene tape went up around the SUV, and a perimeter was established that pushed us volunteer firefighters to the edge of the action. Vernon Hatch was loaded into the ambulance, still talking to anyone who would listen, his bandaged head turning frantically as Deputy Russo rode along with him. I overheard one of the state troopers mention that they were sending units to check the bridge overpass Vernon had described, about 20 miles north on a county road near the Tippecanoe County line. Randy pulled us together near his truck and told us we were free to go, that our job here was done, but none of us moved right away. There was an unspoken understanding that we had stumbled into something bigger than a simple traffic accident, and walking away felt incomplete somehow. Cliff finally broke the silence by saying he needed to get home to his kids, and Pete muttered something about needing coffee, and slowly we drifted back to our vehicles. I sat in my pickup for a long moment before starting the engine, watching the coroner's team carefully extract the blue tarp from the overturned Explorer. The shape inside was unmistakably human, and even from 50 yards away I could see the stiffness of the limbs, the unnatural angles that only death can create. I drove home in a daze, my mind running through everything I had seen and heard. Shelley was awake when I walked in, making pancakes for our 2 boys, and she took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I told her it had been a rough call but didn't go into details. Some things you don't bring to the breakfast table, especially not with a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old asking why Daddy looked so tired. I ate mechanically, showered, and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that foot sticking out from under the tarp, the dark red polish on the toenails. I kept thinking about Vernon Hatch and his impossible story, the fear in his eyes when he grabbed my wrist, The desperation in his voice when he swore he hadn't hurt her. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he really was just a panicked idiot who made a catastrophic decision on a freezing highway in the middle of the night. But another part of me, the part that had seen the way he avoided looking at the SUV, the way his hands trembled even before I touched his wound, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than he was telling. The news broke 2 days later. I was at the fire station doing equipment maintenance when Randy called me into his office and showed me the article on his computer screen. The woman in the tarp had been identified as Marissa Keene, 31 years old, a dental hygienist from West Lafayette, who had been reported missing by her roommate on New Year's Eve. According to the preliminary coroner's report, she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, and the estimated time of death was somewhere between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning on December 31st, hours before Vernon Hatch claimed to have found her body on the side of the road. The article went on to say that Hatch had been arrested and charged with murder, that investigators had found evidence linking him to the victim, and that he was being held without bail pending further investigation. I read the words twice, 3 times, trying to reconcile them with the man I had treated on that frozen highway. The scared, confused, desperate man who had grabbed my wrist and sworn he was innocent. Randy closed the browser and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. "Hell of a way to start the new year," he said quietly. I nodded but didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would make any of it make sense. The details came out slowly over the following weeks, pieced together from news reports and courtroom documents and the occasional conversation with Deputy Russo, who I ran into at a gas station one evening in late January. Vernon Hatch, it turned out, had known Marissa Keene. They had met at a grief support group in Lafayette about 8 months earlier. Vernon had lost his wife to cancer in 2022, and Marissa had lost her younger brother in a motorcycle accident. According to witnesses from the group, they had formed a friendship that Vernon apparently misinterpreted as something more. When Marissa gently rejected his advances, he became obsessive, showing up at her workplace, sending dozens of text messages, leaving notes on her car. She had filed for a restraining order just 2 weeks before her death, but it hadn't been processed yet. On New Year's Eve, investigators believed, Vernon followed her from a party she had attended with friends, forced her off the road near that bridge overpass, and killed her in a rage. The tarp, the bungee cords, the whole elaborate story about finding her body. It was all a desperate attempt to create an alibi that fell apart the moment he lost control of his SUV on the ice. Vernon Hatch was convicted of first-degree murder in September of that year and sentenced to life without parole. I didn't attend the trial, but I followed it in the news, reading every article I could find like I was searching for something that would help me understand. The thing that haunts me even now isn't the image of that foot sticking out from under the tarp, or the way Marissa Keene's family wept in the courtroom when the verdict was read. It's the way Vernon looked at me on that frozen highway, the way he grabbed my wrist and begged me to believe him. In that moment, I did believe him. I looked into his eyes and saw what I thought was genuine terror, genuine confusion, and I felt sorry for him. I've been a volunteer firefighter long enough to think I can read people, to trust my instincts about who's telling the truth and who's lying. But Vernon Hatch fooled me completely. He sat there with blood running down his face and told me a story so absurd that it almost sounded true, and I bought it. I think about that sometimes when I respond to calls now, when I'm treating someone at an accident scene or a house fire and they're telling me what happened. I think about how easy it is to believe someone who seems scared, who seems vulnerable, who seems like a victim. And I remember that the real victim that morning was wrapped in a blue tarp in the back of an overturned SUV, silent and cold, while her killer sat 15 feet away convincing me he was innocent. That's what stays with me. That's what I can't forget. The knowledge that I looked evil in the face and felt nothing but sympathy. Celebrating my birthday on December 31st always felt like a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the whole world throws a party. On the other, Good luck getting anyone to focus on you when fireworks and champagne are involved. By 2024, after graduating college in 2017 and spending years building a career in marketing, I figured I deserved one night of real celebration. My friend Heather had been raving about this upscale nightclub downtown called Velour for months. One of those places where the cocktails cost $20 and the bouncers wear earpieces like Secret Service agents. She convinced me that ringing in the new year there would be the perfect way to mark another trip around the sun. I spent $200 on a sequined dress and another $50 on heels I could barely walk in. Heather picked me up around 10, and we arrived just as the line was wrapping around the block. The bass from inside vibrated through the concrete, and I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed. The interior of Velour matched every expectation I had built in my head. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting prismatic light across a dance floor packed with bodies moving in synchronized chaos. VIP sections were roped off with velvet, occupied by people who looked like they belonged in magazine spreads. Heather grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward the main bar, where 3 bartenders in matching black vests were shaking cocktails like performers. I ordered a single vodka cranberry, my only drink of the night, wanting to stay sharp enough to actually remember the countdown. Heather disappeared into the crowd around 11, chasing after some guy she recognized from her spin class, and I found a spot near one of the tall tables overlooking the dance floor. The music was loud, the energy electric, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time in months. I checked my phone, saw it was 11:42, and started scanning the room for Heather so we could find a good spot for midnight. That was when a man in a server uniform approached my table carrying a tray with a single champagne flute. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a shaved head and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. His uniform matched the other staff members perfectly: black vest, white dress shirt, even the little gold pin on his collar that said Velour in cursive script. He smiled and placed the glass in front of me, leaning in close to be heard over the music. "Complimentary champagne for the countdown," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the bar. I thanked him without a second thought. This was exactly the kind of thing upscale clubs did, especially on New Year's Eve. He nodded once and disappeared into the crowd before I could even ask if he had seen a redhead in a green dress, which was Heather. The champagne looked expensive, with tiny bubbles rising in perfect columns, and I brought it to my lips without hesitation. The first sip tasted slightly bitter, which I attributed to whatever high-end brand they were pouring. I took another small sip and set the glass down, turning my attention back to the dance floor. 11:47. The DJ was building toward something, layering beats that made the whole room pulse like a single living organism. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, subtle at first, like standing up too fast. I gripped the edge of the table and blinked hard, trying to focus. The light seemed brighter, the music louder, and the faces around me started to blur at the edges. My legs felt heavy, as if someone had filled my shoes with wet sand. I had experienced tipsy before, and this was not that. 1 vodka cranberry and 2 sips of champagne should not have done this to me. My vision started narrowing, the periphery going dark like someone was slowly closing curtains on either side of my eyes. I fumbled for my phone, but my fingers felt thick and clumsy, disconnected from my brain. I needed to move. I needed to find Heather, find a security guard, find anyone who could help me. I pushed myself away from the table and immediately stumbled, catching myself on the arm of a stranger who barely glanced at me, before turning back to his conversation. The room was spinning now, not dramatically like in movies, but in slow tilts that made every step feel like walking on a ship in rough waters. I aimed for the restrooms, remembering they were near the back hallway, past the second bar. People bumped into me constantly, too absorbed in their own celebrations to notice a woman struggling to stay upright. The countdown clock on the main screen showed 11:51, 9 minutes until the new year. 9 minutes until everyone would be screaming and kissing and completely oblivious to anything else happening around them. I made it maybe 20 feet before 2 men appeared on either side of me, one grabbing my elbow and the other placing a hand on my lower back. "Hey, there she is," the one on my left said loudly, his voice carrying a practiced cheerfulness that made my stomach turn. "We have been looking everywhere for you." He was shorter than the man who gave me the champagne, stocky with a thick neck and a goatee that looked like it had been drawn on with a marker. The other one was younger, maybe mid-20s, with sandy hair and a polo shirt that screamed fraternity alumni. They moved in perfect coordination, guiding me toward the back of the club like they had done this 100 times before. I tried to pull away, but my arm felt like it belonged to someone else. "She always does this," the younger one said to a couple who glanced our way, shaking his head with an exasperated smile. "Too much champagne, you know how it is." The couple laughed and returned to their drinks. Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked if I was okay. It was New Year's Eve, and everyone assumed I was just another drunk girl being helped home by her friends. Somewhere deep in the fog, clouding my brain, a survival instinct kicked in. I remembered reading somewhere that you should make a scene. Be loud, be difficult, because predators rely on compliance. I planted my heels into the floor as hard as I could, which was not very hard given my condition, and let out a sound that was meant to be a scream, but came out more like a strangled moan. The stocky one tightened his grip on my elbow, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises I would find the next morning. "Easy now," he muttered close to my ear, his breath hot and smelling like whiskey. "You are making a scene." I saw the restroom sign glowing maybe 15 feet ahead and made a decision. I went completely limp, letting my body drop like dead weight. The move caught them off guard, and for a split second their grip loosened. I threw myself sideways, crashing into a group of women in matching silver dresses who shrieked and spilled their drinks everywhere. The chaos gave me just enough cover to crawl on my hands and knees, toward the bathroom door. I do not remember pushing the door open. I do not remember locking myself in the handicap stall at the far end. What I remember is pressing my back against the cold tile wall and fumbling with my phone, my vision swimming so badly that the screen looked like it was underwater. I managed to pull up the number for the club, which I had saved earlier in case Heather and I got separated. A woman answered on the third ring, barely audible over the music bleeding through the line. "I need security," I said, or at least I tried to say. The words came out slurred and broken. "Someone drugged me. 2 men, trying to take me out." There was a pause, then her voice sharpened. "Where are you right now?" "Bathroom," I managed. "Back hallway." "Stay there," she said. "Do not move. Do not open the door for anyone except security. They will knock 3 times and say the word midnight." I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, my sequined dress bunched up around my thighs, and I waited. The bathroom door opened twice while I sat there. The first time, I heard heels clicking on tile and 2 women laughing about someone named Brad who had apparently kissed the wrong girl at the bar. They fixed their makeup, complained about the line, and left without ever knowing I was 10 feet away fighting to stay conscious. The second time was worse. The door creaked open slowly, and there were no voices, no heels, just the soft thud of flat shoes on tile. I held my breath, which was difficult because my lungs felt like they were wrapped in plastic. The footsteps moved methodically, stopping at each stall. I watched the shadow pass under the gap at the bottom of my door, a dark shape that paused for just a moment too long. Then a knock. Not 3 knocks. Just one, slow and deliberate. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making any sound. The shadow lingered, and I could hear breathing on the other side of the door, patient and unhurried. Then the main bathroom door burst open and a woman's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Security, we are clearing the restroom." The shadow retreated instantly, footsteps quick and light, disappearing out the door before the security team could fully enter. I heard a woman's voice call out, asking if anyone needed assistance, and I finally let myself speak. "In here," I croaked. "Back stall." The lock clicked open from the outside, and I found myself staring up at a woman in a black polo with "security" printed across the chest in white letters. She was built like someone who had played college softball, broad shoulders and arms that looked like they could throw a punch without thinking twice. Behind her stood a man with a shaved head and a radio crackling on his hip. The woman crouched down to my level, her eyes scanning my face with a clinical efficiency that made me feel both safe and terrified. "Can you tell me what happened?" I told her everything I could remember, my words still thick and clumsy. The champagne, the man in the server uniform, the two men who tried to take me outside. She exchanged a look with her partner that told me this was not the first time they had heard a story like mine. They brought me to a back office, a small room cluttered with monitors showing feeds from cameras positioned throughout the club. The countdown had already happened while I was on the bathroom floor, and confetti still drifted through the main room like glitter snow. A manager named Vince, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a receding hairline, sat me down with a bottle of water and started pulling up footage. The female security guard, whose name was Jackie, stayed by my side the entire time. Within minutes, they found him. The man in the server uniform appeared on camera at 11:38, walking through a service entrance near the loading dock. He was not on the employee roster. He had acquired a staff wristband from somewhere, probably stolen it off a real server, and had walked through the back hallways like he belonged there. On another monitor, they tracked him moving through the crowd, champagne flute in hand, stopping at my table for less than 30 seconds before vanishing again. Vince rewound and zoomed in, and I saw it clearly. The moment before he approached me, he pulled a small vial from his pocket and tipped something into the glass. But what made me feel truly sick was the footage from the back exit. Starting around 11:50, the same man appeared on the camera covering the rear door, the one that led to the alley behind the club. He checked the handle. He looked at his phone. He paced a few steps away, then came back. Every 2 or 3 minutes he repeated this pattern, his eyes fixed on the door like a predator waiting at a watering hole. The timestamp in the corner ticked past midnight, past 12:15, past 12:30. He only left when a delivery truck pulled into the alley at 12:42, headlights flooding the area and forcing him to retreat into the shadows and eventually out of frame. The two men who had tried to escort me out of the club never appeared on that camera. Jackie told me they had probably been stationed inside to guide targets toward the exit, while the man outside handled whatever came next. Targets. She used that word like it was routine, like they had a whole system figured out. The police arrived around 1 in the morning. 2 detectives, a man and a woman, took my statement, while a paramedic checked my vitals and drew blood to confirm what everyone already knew. They found traces of gamma-hydroxybutyrate in my system, the same substance that shows up in dozens of cases like mine every year. Heather finally appeared around 1:30. Mascara streaked down her face, sobbing and apologizing for disappearing. I did not have the energy to be angry with her. The detectives told me they would pull the footage, run facial recognition, do everything they could. But their tone carried a weight I recognized, the kind of professional pessimism that comes from working too many cases that go nowhere. The men knew how to avoid being identified. They wore no distinctive clothing, had no visible tattoos, and the camera angles never captured a clear shot of the tall one's face. The wristband had been reported stolen by a server who noticed it missing around 10:45, but assumed he had simply misplaced it in the chaos of the night. These men had done this before. They would probably do it again. I spent New Year's Day in bed, curtains drawn, jumping at every sound from the hallway outside my apartment. Heather stayed with me for 3 days straight, sleeping on my couch and checking the locks every few hours. The bruises on my arm turned purple, then yellow, then faded into nothing. The police called twice over the following weeks, once to confirm the toxicology results, and once to tell me they had not been able to identify any of the 3 men. The case went cold, filed away with hundreds of others just like it. I still think about that night, about the single knock on the bathroom stall door and the breathing on the other side. I think about the man waiting by the back exit, checking his phone, patient as a spider in a web. Sometimes I wonder if he found someone else that night after I escaped, someone who did not make it to the bathroom in time. I do not go to clubs anymore. I do not accept drinks I did not watch being poured. And every December 31st, while the rest of the world celebrates, I stay home with the doors locked and the lights on, grateful to be alive and terrified of the people who tried to make sure I would not be. New Year's Eve has always been my excuse to stay indoors. While everyone else floods the streets and packs into bars, I prefer the quiet of my own apartment. A modest 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building in a working-class neighborhood just outside of Houston. My sister Vicky keeps telling me I need to get out more, that turning 34 means nothing if I spend every holiday like a hermit. But after 10 years working as an HVAC technician, crawling through attics and dealing with people's broken units all day, the last thing I want is to squeeze into some overcrowded venue with strangers screaming in my ear. That Wednesday night, December 31st, 2023, felt like any other quiet celebration to me. I had invited my buddy Jerome and his wife Patty over for some food, a few beers, and whatever countdown show was playing on TV. Nothing fancy, nothing wild. Just 3 people in their 30s acting their age for once. My apartment sat on Ridgecrest Drive, a street that got louder every year as the neighborhood changed, but I figured the noise would die down by 1 or 2 in the morning like it always did. Jerome and Patty left around 12:30, right after we watched the ball drop and clinked our bottles together. Patty had to work an early shift at the hospital the next morning, so they didn't stick around long. I remember standing at my door, waving them off as they walked down the outdoor corridor toward the stairwell, their footsteps echoing against the concrete. The air outside was thick with the smell of gunpowder and barbecue smoke, and I could hear fireworks popping somewhere in the distance, or at least what I assumed were fireworks. That distinction would matter a lot more in about 20 minutes. I closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and started gathering up the paper plates and empty bottles from my coffee table. My TV was still on, some post-midnight coverage showing celebrations in Times Square, and I had this peaceful feeling in my chest like the night had gone exactly as planned. I carried the trash into the kitchen, tossed it in the bin under the sink, and grabbed a wet rag to wipe down the counter. Everything was calm, everything was normal, and I had no idea that my ceiling was about to explode. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when I heard the first crack. It wasn't like a firework. Fireworks have that whistling buildup, that theatrical pause before the boom. This was sharp, sudden, like someone snapping a thick branch right above my head. I looked up at the ceiling just in time to see a chunk of drywall the size of my fist come loose and tumble down onto my living room carpet. Dust puffed up from the impact, little white particles floating in the glow of my floor lamp. For a second, I just stood there with the wet rag in my hand, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that something had fallen on the roof, maybe a piece of debris from a firework or some drunk idiot throwing something off a balcony. But then I noticed the hole, a small, dark puncture in the ceiling surrounded by cracked plaster, perfectly round, like someone had driven a nail through from the apartment above. Except there was no apartment above me. I lived on the top floor, and above my ceiling was nothing but roofing material and open Texas sky. I walked over slowly, my brain still not catching up to what my eyes were telling me. The debris on the carpet wasn't just drywall. There was something else mixed in, something small and metallic glinting under the lamplight. I crouched down and saw it clearly. A bullet, deformed and flattened on one side, sitting right there on my beige carpet like it belonged there. I picked it up without thinking, and the heat surprised me so much that I almost dropped it. The metal was warm, not burning hot, but definitely warm. The kind of temperature you feel when you grab a coffee mug that's been sitting out for 10 minutes. My mind raced through possibilities. A gun accident in a neighboring building, some kind of malfunction, maybe a hunter somewhere outside the city limits. None of it made sense. I was standing in my own living room holding a bullet that had just fallen from my ceiling. And outside, I could still hear what sounded like 100 firecrackers going off in every direction. That's when the second shot came through. This one was closer. Way closer. The crack was louder, more violent, and a spray of white dust erupted from the ceiling maybe 6 feet to my left, right above the edge of my couch. I watched in horror as a second chunk of drywall broke loose and crashed onto the cushions, followed by another bullet that bounced off the armrest and rolled onto the floor. My body finally caught up to my brain, and I dropped to my knees behind the kitchen island, pressing my back against the cabinets. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my temples, in my fingertips. Someone was shooting at my apartment. That was the only thought I could form. Someone was shooting at my apartment, and I had no idea who or why. I pressed myself lower, trying to make myself as small as possible, my cheek against the cold tile floor. The popcorn ceiling above me suddenly looked like a minefield, every inch of it a potential entry point for the next round. I could hear more pops outside, more cracks, more explosions that I now knew weren't fireworks at all. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my fingers clumsy and uncooperative. The screen lit up and I dialed 911, pressing the phone hard against my ear while keeping my body flat behind the island. It rang 4 times before someone picked up, and the voice on the other end sounded exhausted, overwhelmed like they'd already answered 1,000 calls that night. I tried to explain what was happening. Bullets coming through my ceiling, 2 shots already, I'm hiding in my kitchen. But the words came out jumbled and frantic. The dispatcher asked for my address and I gave it to her, spelling out Ridgecrest Drive twice because she couldn't hear me over the noise in the background on her end. Then she said something that made my entire body go cold. She told me that they were receiving dozens of calls about gunfire across the city, that officers were stretched thin responding to shootings and accidents, and that it might be 30 to 40 minutes before anyone could get to my location. 30 to 40 minutes. I was lying on my kitchen floor with bullets punching through my roof, and the best they could offer was maybe an hour. The dispatcher told me to stay low and stay away from windows, like I needed instructions on how to not get shot. She said she'd keep my call logged as a priority, but I could hear the doubt in her voice, the resignation of someone who knew the system was failing in real time. I thanked her anyway and hung up, then immediately called Jerome. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy like he'd already fallen asleep in the car ride home. I told him what was happening, speaking fast and low, and I heard Patty gasp in the background when she understood. Jerome wanted to come back, wanted to drive over right then. But I told him no. The streets were chaos. People were firing guns into the air everywhere. And the last thing I needed was my best friend catching a stray bullet on his way to save me. He made me promise to keep texting him every few minutes, to let him know I was still okay. I promised, even though I had no idea if I would be okay, if any of us would be okay, if this nightmare would ever end. I army crawled from the kitchen toward the hallway, keeping my body as flat as possible against the tile. My bathroom was at the end of the hall, a small, windowless room with a cast-iron bathtub that my landlord had never bothered to replace. In that moment, that old ugly tub seemed like the safest place in the world, surrounded by walls on all sides, no ceiling exposure to the roof, just solid porcelain and iron between me and whatever was falling from the sky. I pulled myself along the floor, my elbows burning against the rough surface, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Another crack echoed somewhere outside, followed by a whoop of celebration and more gunfire. I realized then what was happening, why the bullets were coming down at random angles, why the police couldn't stop it. It wasn't a shooting in the traditional sense. It was celebratory gunfire. People all over the neighborhood, maybe all over the city, firing their pistols straight up into the air to ring in the new year. And what goes up, as they say, must come down. Every bullet that left those barrels was arcing through the night sky and falling back to earth with enough force to punch through roofing material, through drywall, through flesh and bone if you were unlucky enough to be in its path. I made it to the bathroom and climbed into the tub, pulling myself over the cold porcelain edge and curling up at the bottom like a child hiding from a thunderstorm. The cast iron pressed against my spine, hard and unforgiving, but I didn't care. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the bathroom ceiling, listening to the chaos outside. Every pop made me flinch. Every crack sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I kept my phone clutched against my chest, the screen lighting up every few minutes with texts from Jerome asking if I was still alive. I typed back one-word responses. Yes, okay, still here. because I couldn't manage anything more. Time moved strangely in that bathtub. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days. I could hear music playing from somewhere down the street, bass thumping through the walls, people laughing and shouting like the world wasn't raining bullets. At one point, I heard a woman scream, a sharp piercing sound that cut through everything else, and I pressed my palms over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut and prayed it wasn't what I thought it was. The third bullet came through around 1:15 in the morning. I heard it hit somewhere in the apartment, a distant thud followed by the familiar sound of debris falling. I didn't move from the bathtub. I couldn't move. My legs had gone numb from the awkward position, and my back was screaming from being pressed against the hard surface for so long, but none of that mattered. I just lay there, counting the seconds between each burst of gunfire outside, trying to calculate how many more rounds might be headed my way. I thought about my mom, who lived alone in a single-story house on the other side of town, and wondered if she was safe. I thought about Jerome and Patty, probably home by now, probably lying in their bed unable to sleep. I thought about all the New Year's Eves I had spent complaining about the noise, rolling my eyes at the reckless idiots shooting their guns into the air, never once imagining that I would end up cowering in my bathtub while their bullets punched holes through my home. The gunfire outside seemed to come in waves, intense barrages followed by brief moments of quiet, then building up again like a storm that refused to pass. Somewhere around 2:30, the shooting started to slow down. The gaps between bursts grew longer, the pops more scattered, the whoops and cheers less frequent. I stayed in the tub anyway, not trusting the silence, not trusting anything. My phone battery had dropped to 12%, and I watched it tick down with growing anxiety, knowing that if something else happened, I might not be able to call for help. At 3 in the morning, I finally heard sirens, not coming to my building but somewhere nearby, maybe a block or two over. I wondered if someone had been hit, if that woman's scream I heard earlier had been more than just fear. I wondered how many people across the city were lying in bathtubs just like me, or hiding under beds, or pressing themselves flat against floors while the sky rained metal. The thought made me feel less alone and more terrified at the same time. By 3:30, the gunfire had mostly stopped, replaced by the distant wail of ambulances and the occasional bark of a dog. I waited another 30 minutes before I trusted myself to move, my muscles stiff and aching as I pulled myself up and over the edge of the tub. I walked through my apartment like a survivor, surveying the wreckage after a natural disaster. The living room was covered in a thin layer of white dust from the ceiling damage. I found 3 holes total, one above the carpet where the first bullet came through, one above the couch from the second, and a third near my bedroom door that I hadn't even heard happen. The bullets themselves were scattered across the floor, small deformed pieces of metal that had traveled through the night sky before crashing into my life. I picked them up one by one and dropped them into a glass jar on my kitchen counter, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline that hadn't fully left my system. The police finally showed up around 4:15, 2 exhausted officers who took photos of the damage and filled out a report that I knew would go nowhere. They told me that dozens of people had called in similar complaints, that at least 3 people in the greater Houston area had been hit by stray bullets that night, including a teenager who was in critical condition at Memorial Hermann. They gave me a case number and a pamphlet about victim services and wished me a happy new year on their way out the door. I moved out of that apartment 6 weeks later, broke my lease, paid the penalty, and found a ground floor unit in a quieter part of town where the neighbors are mostly retirees and young families. My landlord tried to charge me for the ceiling repairs, but I threatened to go to the local news with photos of the bullet holes, and he backed off pretty quick. Jerome helped me pack up my stuff, and when we carried the last box down to the moving truck, I looked up at my old living room window and felt nothing but relief. I still have those 3 bullets in that glass jar, sitting on a shelf in my new place like some kind of morbid souvenir. People ask me about them sometimes, and I tell them the story, and they always react the same way. Disbelief first, then horror. Then that uncomfortable silence that comes when someone realizes how close you came to not being here anymore. My sister Vicky says I should throw them away, that keeping them is unhealthy, but I disagree. I keep them because I need to remember how random it all was, how easily one of those rounds could have come through while I was standing up instead of crouching down. New Year's Eve came around again this past December, and I spent it at my mom's house on the other side of town, far from the neighborhoods where people still think firing guns into the air is a celebration. We watched the countdown on her old television, drank sparkling cider because she doesn't keep alcohol in the house, and when midnight hit, I flinched at every distant pop I heard outside. She noticed, of course. Moms always notice. And she put her hand on my arm and told me I was safe. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the truth is, I don't think I'll ever hear fireworks the same way again. Every crack, every boom, every whistle sends my mind back to that bathtub, to those hours spent curled up against cold porcelain while the world fell apart above me. I survived that night by pure luck, nothing more. The bullets that came through my ceiling could have hit me just as easily as they hit the drywall. And somewhere out there, the people who fired those shots probably don't even know what they did. They probably woke up the next morning with hangovers and empty magazines, and no idea that their celebration almost ended my life. That's the part that haunts me the most. Not the fear, not the helplessness, but the randomness of it all. The complete and total randomness. The last night of that year still sits in my memory with this strange mix of excitement and static, like a song that cuts out right before the best part. I'd headed downtown with my friend Marissa because neither of us wanted to spend New Year's Eve alone in our apartments again. The city had turned the main square into this giant glowing stage, packed with food trucks, metallic confetti drifting over everyone's heads, and a countdown timer projected against a building that reflected the lights like a cracked mirror. I remember feeling almost weightless from the noise and the closeness of people leaning shoulder to shoulder, just trying to see the fireworks better. At that moment, everything felt safe, crowded, but safe. Marissa kept tugging at my sleeve, pointing at strangers' ridiculous hats or couples rehearsing kisses too early. We laugh the way you laugh when you're trying to convince yourself the year will be different just because the clock says so. The countdown hit 0, and the square erupted with a roar so loud it felt like the air thickened around us. People jumped, hugged, screamed, and that huge surge of bodies moved in every direction at once. Marissa and I lifted our phones to film, trying not to poke anyone in the eye, while fireworks exploded behind the skyscrapers in colors so bright they washed out the whole sky. It took maybe 2 minutes for the happy chaos to shift into something far more frantic. The crowd started pushing toward the metro entrance we needed to reach, and our steps got pulled into that tide whether we wanted them to or not. Marissa was right in front of me, literally an arm's length, her hair full of glitter, her silver scarf trailing like a tail behind her. I kept my eyes on that scarf because it became the only anchor I had in the movement. By the time we reached the sidewalk near the metro steps, that anchor slipped. A group surged between us, drunk and loud, and bodies shuttled us apart in this jittery sideways motion I couldn't control. I tried calling her name, but the fireworks drowned everything out. I could still see the top of her head, but the stream of people pushed her forward faster than me, almost funneling her toward the entrance. It didn't feel threatening, just messy, so I figured she was getting carried ahead and would wait for me downstairs. My boot slid slightly on crushed confetti, and someone bumped my shoulder hard enough to tilt my balance. When I regained it, her silver scarf was nowhere in sight. Still, that didn't alarm me yet. It was New Year's Eve. People were basically a living river at that point. Inside the station, the atmosphere felt tighter, like the walls were amplifying every leftover shout and every echo from the street above. Trains were pulling in and out non-stop, trying to move crowds before things turned into another headline about injuries near the square. I stepped into the first car that opened, scanning faces quickly, expecting to see Marissa waving me over with that mocking, "took you long enough" expression she always used. Instead, my phone buzzed right as the doors were about to close. The message preview lit up my screen in this stark white box that didn't match the celebration at all. It was from Marissa, sent seconds earlier, and it read, "Someone's pulling me. Help." The doors slid shut in front of me before I could step out. The train lurched forward, but my mind barely registered the movement. That message didn't match the tone of anything we'd lived in the past hour, and the wording hit me with this sharp clarity that cut through the leftover excitement. I squeezed past a couple leaning against the pole and hit the emergency intercom before I could second-guess myself. My voice came out too loud, telling the operator I needed to get off at the next stop immediately. People stared, but no one asked what was happening. Everyone looked exhausted from the crowd. When the train stopped, I pushed through the doors the second they opened and sprinted up the escalator 2 steps at a time, my heart slamming against my ribs in a messy rhythm that had nothing to do with panic attacks and everything to do with the fact that Marissa wasn't answering a single call. Outside, the fireworks were still echoing across the downtown buildings, masking sirens and shouts from somewhere close. When I reached the street level, the police presence had doubled. Officers were guiding injured people toward makeshift aid stations, and I overheard someone mention crush injuries near the center of the square. That only added to the mess in my head, but I forced myself to retrace our route as precisely as I could. Every block looked slightly distorted, as if the combination of smoke, confetti, and leftover bursts of light had thrown a filter over the city. I followed the path we'd carved through the crowd earlier, checking the ground for anything familiar. A glove, a hat, a metallic noisemaker. None of it mattered. None of it was hers. My brain kept clinging to the last clear image I had of her. That silver scarf dragging lightly against the pavement as she pushed toward the metro steps. It took me several minutes to reach the spot where we'd been separated, and that's when I noticed a shape on the ground that hadn't been there before. The scarf lay half crumpled near the side of a maintenance doorway built into the station wall. The metal door was supposed to stay locked. Every local knew that. Yet it sat slightly ajar as if someone had nudged it with their foot while passing through. The scarf looked like it had been dropped mid-movement, not placed gently. I crouched and picked it up, and there was this faint smell of the cologne she'd been wearing earlier, mixed with something damp and metallic that didn't fit the night at all. I called her again, straight to voicemail. Something in my chest tightened, and I backed away just enough to catch a breath before leaning toward the doorway. Inside the narrow opening, a sliver of yellow light flickered, the kind produced by old bulbs that hum louder than they shine. The passage led downward, not deep, but enough that the sounds of the street faded into a muffled roar. A sign on the wall read, "Authorized personnel only," and the paint was peeling like bark off a dying tree. I hesitated because stepping in felt like breaking a boundary the city had drawn on purpose. But the scarf was still in my hand, and the message on my phone hadn't magically changed. I slipped through the doorway, keeping one hand on the wall because the floor slanted unevenly. The deeper I went, the more the tunnel carried this sharp smell of dust and wet concrete, and something else, something that reminded me of a basement after a flood. The tunnel curved left, then right, like it had been added in pieces over the years without any real planning. As I walked, the noise from above dissolved completely, replaced by the echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the walls in uneven patterns. That echo wasn't consistent, though. Every few seconds there was a second sound trailing mine, not synchronized, not repeated in the same rhythm. It felt like someone ahead of me was adjusting their pace on purpose. I kept calling Marissa's name, but the tunnel swallowed my voice, smothering the edges of it. The air grew heavier as I moved deeper, and the yellow bulbs blinked more frequently, making the whole place pulse like a heartbeat I wasn't part of. Eventually, the narrow passage opened into a larger service room filled with old equipment and cables, coiled across the floor like abandoned ropes. In the center of the room, a utility cart sat turned on its side, and behind it was a small alcove, no wider than a closet. I saw movement, tiny, hesitant, like someone pulling their hand away from the light. When I stepped closer, something shifted inside the alcove and a person rushed out, stumbling into me with so much force that we both slid across the dusty floor. It was Marissa. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her voice scratchy from screaming in a place where no one could hear her. She kept saying someone had grabbed her wrist in the crowd and steered her toward the doorway, guiding her with this unsettling confidence, like they'd done it before. Before I could make sense of any of it, a shadow moved in the far corner of the room, a figure stepping back into darkness the moment our eyes met. The outline was tall, shoulders stiff, posture deliberate. Whoever it was didn't run. They simply retreated into a side passage with the slow certainty of someone who knew the layout far better than we did. I grabbed Marissa's arm, and we bolted in the opposite direction, retracing our steps through the tunnel as fast as our legs allowed. When we reached the doorway, 2 transit officers were already there, alerted by a station tech who'd seen the door open on his monitors. They pulled us out, locked the entrance, and called for backup, while Marissa tried explaining what had happened in broken, trembling sentences. Hours later, after statements, after medical checks, after far too many questions, one of the officers told us something that has stayed with me ever since. Security footage from the metro entrances showed multiple individuals being subtly redirected toward that same locked doorway throughout the night. The person doing it blended perfectly into the crowd each time, never touching anyone long enough to draw attention. They waited for moments when fireworks exploded, when the crowd surged, when no one was looking at anything except the sky. The police never found the person in the tunnel. They searched every inch before sealing it permanently, welding the door shut so no one could enter again. Marissa and I moved out of the city a few months later, and to this day, we don't talk about that night unless someone asks why we never attend public countdowns anymore. I still have her scarf folded in a drawer, and even now I check every doorway near a station before I walk past it. The drive home after the New Year fireworks usually felt like a small ritual for us. Windows cracked open to let out the smell of sparklers, heater buzzing, and my daughter half asleep in the back seat with one of her boots off. That night, though, the road cutting past the old industrial lots seemed darker than usual, like the streetlights were taking turns failing. I remember leaning forward in my seat, trying to make sense of the shapes outside while my brother, Mark, joked about how the town somehow looked older every year. We weren't in a hurry, just easing our way back after visiting relatives, still carrying that warm, tired feeling you get when the night went longer than planned. Nothing about that moment hinted that things were about to take such a sharp turn. The quiet in the car was almost comforting until Mark muttered something and tapped the brakes. At first, I thought he had slowed down because of debris on the shoulder, maybe some leftover fireworks, or a bag that fell from someone's truck. But as the headlights stretched farther across the pavement, a shape stood out, too still, too human. The figure lay close to the gravel line, one arm bent under the body, and the other stretched out like they'd been trying to reach the grass. My chest tightened as I leaned closer, half afraid of seeing a face. The person's jacket had this strange, reflective strip that caught the light, not the kind used on work coats, more like one someone had sewn on themselves. Mark didn't say a word for a solid 5 seconds, just gripping the wheel with this tense calm that only appeared when he was trying not to scare the rest of us. When he pulled onto the shoulder, the car rolled to a stop with a slow crunch of gravel, and I could feel that eerie stillness sink in, the kind that makes every small sound seem louder. The air outside looked thick, almost muffled, and the only movement came from the blinking hazard lights reflecting off bits of broken pavement. Mark told me to stay in the car while he called emergency services, but I stepped out anyway, keeping a few feet behind him. The person on the ground didn't move at all, not even a twitch. There was this odd detail I can't shake. One of their shoes was several feet away, resting upright as if someone had set it down deliberately. Mark kept his voice steady while talking to dispatch, but the way he kept glancing around made it clear he sensed something wrong lurking beneath the surface of what we were seeing. By the time the first patrol car arrived, the officer barely had to look twice before asking us to step back. He walked along the shoulder with a flashlight angled low, sweeping slow, like he expected the ground to tell him a story. It didn't take long for him to find the tire marks, deep, curved impressions cutting across the gravel in a pattern that didn't match a simple accident. Another officer showed up, then a third, and soon they were moving with that clipped urgency people get when they realize they're not dealing with a random tragedy. One of them asked if we'd heard anything earlier, an engine revving, a shout, anything. But the night had been quiet besides the last echo of fireworks. When they told us it looked deliberate, the weight of it settled in so suddenly that even Mark stopped trying to keep his composure for my sake. The neighborhood surrounding that stretch of road slowly came alive as word spread that police were investigating something serious. People stepped out onto porches still wearing party hats, jackets thrown over pajamas, champagne flutes in hand. I remember a woman with a bright red scarf wrapped twice around her neck pointing down the street and telling an officer she'd heard a truck tearing through just after midnight. She described the engine as strained, like someone pushing it harder than it could handle. Another neighbor, an older man leaning heavily on a cane, mentioned seeing headlights swerving near the stop sign moments before disappearing into the dark. The officers marked every detail down, but the way they exchanged glances made it clear these accounts were aligning in a way they didn't like. While they continued gathering statements, one of the detectives, tall guy, narrow face, hair pulled back so tight it almost looked lacquered, approached us. He had this habit of pausing 2 seconds before speaking, as though mentally filtering every sentence. He asked again about the moment we first saw the figure, about the shoe lying away from the body, about how long we'd been parked. Mark answered most of it, but the detective kept watching me as if he wanted a second version of the night to compare against the first. I told him everything I remembered. The sudden stillness, the way the jacket reflected oddly, the absence of skid marks where a driver might have tried to brake. He nodded slowly at each detail, his expression tightening only when dispatch radioed something that made him stiffen and walk off without explanation. A few minutes later, something shifted among the officers, an almost electric ripple of urgency. Additional patrol cars pulled up, and the detective with the lacquered hair returned, now moving faster and speaking with clipped precision. He explained that a missing person alert had just come in from a town a little over an hour away. The description matched the person lying by the shoulder. According to the alert, the individual had been involved in a bar fight earlier that night, one that escalated more violently than anyone there expected. Someone had stormed out afterward, threatening to finish things, and witnesses mentioned a beat-up pickup truck with a dented passenger door speeding away from the parking lot. Hearing that made the scene in front of us tilt into something far heavier than a tragic coincidence. As they processed the information, the truck sightings from the neighbors suddenly snapped into focus for the investigators. The older man with the cane clarified that the truck he'd seen seemed lifted higher than usual, with mismatched headlights, one bright white, one dim and yellowish. The woman with the red scarf added that she noticed a long scrape along the passenger side as it raced past, illuminated briefly by leftover fireworks, smoke hanging low in the air. The detectives exchanged looks with the kind of realization that carries both clarity and dread. Everything was pointing towards someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had chased this person down and used the dark, empty stretch of road as their stage. Standing there, watching the officers pace along the shoulder, I kept replaying the moment we first spotted the figure on the ground. The noise from distant parties had faded by then, leaving the scene oddly quiet, except for the steady hum of police radios. A gust of wind carried the faint popping of leftover fireworks from somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, but it only made the silence feel sharper. Mark leaned against the car, rubbing his jaw, staring at the tire impressions like he expected them to rearrange themselves and reveal something new. Even though we didn't know the victim personally, the weight of what had happened hung over us with this heavy, intrusive presence, as if the road itself had absorbed part of the violence. As the paramedics prepared to transport the victim, the lead detective pulled Mark and me aside. He told us they'd found fragments of blue paint embedded in the gravel, consistent with the description of the pickup from the bar fight. He also mentioned that fresh footprints had been discovered near the grass, scattered and uneven, suggesting the victim had tried to run before collapsing. Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten again. Not from fear, but from the realization that the person had likely seen the truck bearing down on them. The detective asked if we were willing to give statements at the station later that week, and we agreed immediately. It didn't feel like a choice, it felt like something we owed to the person who never made it past that patch of road. We eventually drove home in near silence, each of us locked in our thoughts. The heater clicked occasionally, filling the car with that dry warmth that usually felt comforting. But that night it just felt wrong, mismatched with the mood. When we passed through the last intersection before our street, I caught myself scanning every approaching set of headlights, searching for mismatched beams or a lifted frame. It was an involuntary habit that stuck with me for weeks afterward. Even my daughter, who had slept through most of the ordeal, sensed the tension the next morning when she asked why everyone seemed extra quiet. Mark and I just exchanged a look, neither of us wanting to explain something we barely understood ourselves. A few days later, the detectives called to let us know the pickup had been found abandoned behind an old storage facility 2 towns over. The driver had fled on foot, leaving behind a mess of fingerprints and a cracked phone still logged into social media. By the end of the week, they'd taken a suspect into custody, someone known for losing control when drunk, someone who'd reportedly left the bar swearing they weren't done yet. Hearing that brought a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief because the person wouldn't hurt anyone else. Frustration because knowing the motive didn't make the scene on that roadside any easier to forget. We gave our statements, answered every question, and did what little we could. But even now, whenever New Year's comes around, I find myself thinking of that quiet stretch of pavement and hoping no one else ever ends their night the way that poor soul did. By the time that New Year's Eve rolled around, I'd been juggling too many things at once. My job at a small marketing firm, a shaky relationship I was trying to stabilize, and a general sense that I needed one night to just breathe. So when my friend Lucas dragged me to a house party across town, I figured a few hours away from everything wouldn't hurt. The place belonged to one of his co-workers, a guy I barely knew, and the house was packed with people leaning on countertops, laughing too loudly, clutching cheap champagne in plastic cups. I remember noticing the decor, random thrift store paintings mixed with those battery-powered candles that flicker like they're trying too hard. It felt like every room had a different playlist competing with the next. At some point, while I was standing near a doorway trying to cool off, a woman I'd never seen before approached me. Not casually, she stepped in close like she already knew me. She had sharp, restless eyes and this odd habit of tapping her thumb against her index finger like she was counting seconds. She asked my name, then immediately asked if I wanted to go somewhere quieter with her. I told her I wasn't interested and tried to be polite about it, but she didn't take it well. She leaned in closer, said something under her breath that I couldn't understand, and then walked away so abruptly it almost felt theatrical. I remember watching her disappear into the crowd and feeling an uneasy pressure in my chest, like I'd accidentally broken some unspoken rule. Nothing else weird happened at the party. I went home after midnight, fell asleep on the couch still wearing my jacket, and woke up the next morning to a phone that wouldn't stop vibrating. At first I assumed it was Lucas sending me blurry pictures from the night before. Instead, it was a string of messages from friends asking what the hell I had done. A couple of them weren't even subtle. One told me to explain myself fast. My stomach tightened as I unlocked the first link someone sent. It led to a brand new social media profile using a grainy selfie of me from years ago, slapped beside a long post claiming I'd assaulted a woman at the party. No details, no name attached, just enough vagueness to let people fill in the gaps themselves. Within an hour, the post had been shared into circles I didn't even know I was part of anymore. Old classmates, co-workers, neighbors. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly felt comfortable chiming in with half-baked judgment. My girlfriend didn't answer my calls. Even my boss left a voicemail saying we needed to talk immediately. What really rattled me was the confidence in the fake profile's tone. as if whoever wrote it had practiced mimicking my voice. They added small things only someone who'd observed me closely would know. References to my jacket, the specific drink I'd been holding, the room I'd been in. None of it proved anything, but it painted a picture vivid enough for people to believe whatever they wanted to believe. I kept trying to reach people who knew me well, hoping someone would slow down long enough to hear me out, but most conversations shut down before they even started. One longtime friend sent a single message saying, "Man, this looks really bad," and then vanished offline. Even Lucas, who'd been at the party with me the entire night, hesitated when I called. He told me he hadn't seen anything happen, but that a couple of people claimed the woman I'd spoken with had left the house crying. That detail didn't match anything I remembered, but it was just specific enough to feed the spreading rumor. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of how fast the whole situation had taken on a life of its own. My first instinct was to track down the post's creator, so I dug into the fake profile. Whoever made it had gone to great lengths to hide their tracks. The account had only one friend, an empty-looking profile created on the same day. No personal photos, no background info, not even the usual list of random liked pages, just post after post pushing the same accusation, worded slightly differently each time, almost like they were testing which version would get the most traction. I tried reporting it, but the platform's automated system brushed it off, claiming they found no violation. Seeing that message felt like watching a door lock on its own while I was still standing outside. That afternoon, things got worse. My girlfriend finally called, her voice tight and clipped, asking me to stay at my place for a while so she could think clearly. I could hear chatter in the background, her sister, maybe a friend, feeding her their own interpretations while she tried to talk to me. I kept replaying every second of the night in my head, searching for anything that could have been misunderstood, but nothing fit the story being told. The woman from the party had barely spoken to me beyond that strange interaction. The more I tried to explain this, the more it sounded like I was dodging blame, like I was constructing a narrative instead of just telling the truth. By early evening, someone had taken screenshots of the fake profile and reposted them in a community group connected to my workplace. Colleagues I'd never interacted with were now leaving comments wondering if the company would take appropriate action. When I tried logging into my work email to get ahead of it, I found my access temporarily suspended. That was the moment a kind of heavy electric tension settled in my chest, because it became obvious that whoever targeted me wasn't just stirring up trouble for fun. They were pushing everything toward a point where I'd be isolated, discredited, and unable to defend myself. And the scariest part was realizing that the only person at the party who'd acted strangely was the same woman, whose name I still didn't know. I decided to go back to the house where the party had taken place, hoping someone there might remember the woman, or at least give me her name. When I pulled up, the place was noticeably quieter than the night before. A couple of empty cups were still scattered in the yard, and faint music played from somewhere inside, like someone had forgotten to turn off a speaker. The host, a guy named Trevor, answered the door looking groggy and confused, wearing a hoodie with a faded logo and holding a half-eaten granola bar. When I asked if we could talk, he let me in but kept glancing at his phone as if expecting the conversation to go sideways. I explained everything as calmly as I could, watching his confusion shift into discomfort. When I mentioned the woman who had approached me, he paused as if searching his memory for something that wouldn't come. He said he didn't recognize the description at all. Sharp eyes, constant tapping, that weirdly rehearsed way she spoke. He insisted he'd never invited anyone like that, and would have remembered if she'd caused any trouble. The more he denied knowing her, the stranger the situation felt. He finally admitted that a few people had mentioned seeing someone crying near the bathroom, but nobody could agree on what she looked like. Some said she wore a dark jacket, others insisted it was light-colored. One person swore she had short hair, while someone else was adamant she had long hair pulled into a braid. It was like people were describing 4 different women. As I left the house, I called Lucas again and asked if he could meet me somewhere quiet. He showed up at a small coffee shop near the river, looking uneasy but trying to be supportive. I walked him through everything I'd found so far, and he leaned forward with both elbows on the table, tracing the rim of his cup with one finger while he listened. When I mentioned the conflicting descriptions of the woman, he nodded slowly and said something that stuck with me. "It's like she wanted attention, but not an actual identity." That phrasing hit harder than he probably intended. The idea that someone could deliberately move through a crowd leaving such scattered impressions, barely consistent, yet memorable enough to weaponize, made the whole situation feel less random and more deliberate. On my way home, I decided to check the fake profile again, half hoping it had been taken down. Instead, I found a new post pinned to the top, a long message claiming I'd threatened the woman after she tried to get help. They even added a timestamp suggesting the argument had happened around the same moment I was outside talking with Lucas. The post included a blurry photo of the back of my jacket taken from an angle I didn't recognize. I hadn't felt watched at the party, but clearly someone had been paying very close attention to me. And seeing that picture, slightly tilted, taken from a doorway, made me realize that whoever started this had been close enough to brush past me without me ever noticing. When I got home, I called my brother, who's usually the level-headed one in the family, hoping he'd give me some unbiased perspective. Instead, he sounded wary, like he was choosing every word with caution. He told me he believed me, but he also said the situation was bigger than either of us expected. Someone had messaged him anonymously with screenshots before I even reached out, urging him to take distance for everyone's sake. Hearing that made something tighten behind my ribs. Not fear exactly, but a sharp awareness that the person behind this wasn't just tossing accusations into the void. They were reaching into my life with surgical precision, touching people I trusted before I could. I ended the call feeling like the walls of my life had shifted a few inches inward. That night I barely slept. Instead, I sat on my couch with every light on, scrolling through the fake profile again and again, trying to find a crack in it. Around 3 in the morning, a comment appeared under one of the posts, an account I didn't recognize tagging another person and saying, "Isn't this what you warned us about?" Curious, I clicked on the commenter's profile. Buried in their old posts was a picture from the New Year's Eve party, taken in the kitchen. In the corner, near a stack of red cups, stood the same woman who had approached me. Same restless hands, same intense stare. The photo was time-stamped hours earlier than when she spoke to me, but her expression was identical, like she'd been maintaining the same mask all night. And beside her stood someone I did recognize, Trevor, the host, laughing at something off-camera. The next morning I went back to Trevor's house unannounced. This time he looked more alert, almost expecting me. When I showed him the picture, the color drained from his face. He admitted he remembered the moment it was taken and said the woman had shown up with a coworker of his, a guy I'd met once years ago at a different event, someone I barely remembered, someone who, according to Trevor, had left the party early without saying goodbye. That thread unraveled fast. I looked up the coworker's old posts, and the pattern hit me in an instant. Comments he'd made about people getting away with things, vague rants about being overlooked, and several posts hinting at grudges against people who acted superior. It wasn't solid proof, but it was enough to piece together a disturbing possibility, that he'd orchestrated the entire thing out of resentment, using a stranger with enough social camouflage to stir chaos without being remembered clearly. I confronted him online, sending a long message laying out everything I'd connected. He never replied, but within an hour, the fake profile disappeared, and all the reposts from the secondary account vanished as well. My work access was restored the next day. My girlfriend came over that evening, and the tide of outrage slowly drifted away as people realized the posts were gone. Nobody apologized, and nobody admitted they'd been quick to believe a stranger over me. The whole situation just dissolved, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the accusations themselves. To this day, I don't know whether the woman was part of it or just someone he manipulated into playing a role. But every New Year's Eve since then, I catch myself scanning every room a little too carefully, wondering how close someone can stand without you noticing the damage they're about to cause.